Welcome to an introduction to compositing. So this is all about rendering a background picture and then compositing it with a 3D render that we've done. So we're going to bring different renders together into one final render. Now compositing is done in the node editor. We're going to show you how to view your composite changes live, so anything you change you can see the effect, and then learn how to scale the background image independently of the final render resolution. And you'll see how that can be a bit of a pain if we don't. So let's go hop on over into Blender. Right, so now we're over in Blender. The first thing I want to show you is just a recap on the render layers. So if we go over to our properties panel, properties window here, and go to the render layers tab, and we can see we've got one render layer. Now if we go ahead and render that with the F12 key, we can see that the cube renders. If we turn on another render layer and do exactly the same thing, or you can go up here to the render menu, hit render image, you'll notice that it renders twice. And that's because it's rendering each one of these individually. So do bear in mind, if you've got lots of render layers, it will slow down your render, especially if it's an animation. So I'm going to get rid of this extra render layer we've created at the moment and go to the node editor. Now once we're in the node editor, we need to switch the modes to the compositing node, and along the header bar it is the second option along on this little group of icons along here. Now once we're in there, nothing will visibly change just yet because first of all we don't have use nodes selected, so let's go and put a tick in that box. Okay, so when we zoom in, we can see, very similar to the materials editor when we're using that with nodes, we've got render layers here and it's plugged into the composite node. And this is what you're getting when you render. This is your output, and in this case the render layer is the input. Now there are lots of different types of input and we can add them through the add menu, and if we go to input we can see there is a list we can pick from. Now in this case we'll want to pick image. And if we use an image, we can go and find the image that you've downloaded and prepared for this particular section. There we go. I'm just going to open that up. Looks wonderful. And if I plug that in to our composite output, when we go and render, it will look like that. Now, it looks slightly wrong. Now, why does it look wrong? That is because the picture is bigger than the render space we've asked. So let's go to the render properties and have a look. So we've got 50% of 1080 and this picture was quite a high resolution. So if I turn that up to 100, let's just see how that comes out. Okay, it's going to take a few moments to render out. And we can see that there's more of the picture being shown, but not all of it. And this can be a real pain because I certainly don't want to render a super high resolution if I'm just prototyping. I just don't want to do that. So we'll sort this out right away. So let's go back to the node editor, and I'm going to leave this render layers alone at the moment, and we need to do something with this output. So we've got the input, which is the image, and we need to do something before it gets to the output. And we need to add in a distortion, because we're distorting that image, we're changing it, and we've got a scale option. Now when we put the scale option in, there's lots of different choices we can choose from, but to keep it in line with the render output, we need to select render size. There are a couple of options here. In this particular case, I'm going to pick crop. Now it shouldn't matter. Let's render this scene out again. It shouldn't actually matter. We get the cube there, what the rendering settings are set at. So that's the whole picture cropped in to fit the 1080 scene. So that's absolutely fine. We can adjust that if we wanted to, but that's fine with me. Now let's turn this down to, let's say, 20% if I was doing a very quick render, and let's see how that comes out. And let's zoom in. Absolutely fine. And that was really quick as well, a lot quicker than the first time round. Okay, so we've got that all set up now. What else can we do? Well, you can do lots of things in this node editor, just like you can when setting up materials. So you can mix things together, you can change the RGB curves if you wanted to. There's lots you can play with. But one of the things that would be very useful is anything we're changing, it'd be nice to see it live without having to worry about hitting F12 every time and waiting for it to render out. So how do we do that? Well, we need to add a viewer. Now, if you've got Node Wrangler enabled, you can hold down Shift Control and hit in this case, the scale output, and that will introduce a viewer. as an output type. Now what we'll want to do here is I'm going to get rid of that and go add output, output, and there's the viewer. That's how you add it in manually. And we can just link those together. Now we don't see anything as yet. We need to tick on backdrop on the header bar here. So there we go. We can start to see this. And auto render. Now you'll notice that this is tiny, and again it's being governed by this resolution setting over here. So I'm going to turn that back up to 50%. Nothing happens for the moment. It would be really nice if it auto rendered all the time. It sometimes doesn't, so I've turned backdrop on and off again, and there we go. Now it can be a little bit difficult to work out. Let's give myself a bit more space on the screen here. It can be very difficult to actually work with nodes while the image is there. So in the properties panel, that's the N panel of the node editor, we've got a couple of options we can choose from. And if we scroll down where we can see backdrop, it's now turned on. So that's another toggle. It's the same as the one down here. If I use the drop down so I can see what's going on, there's a zoom setting so we can zoom in and out, which is very useful. And we've got an offset as well. Now, I don't tend to play with the offset. I literally hit the move button, and then you can move this freely, perhaps to a top corner. And then we can work on the nodes lower down if we wanted to. We can also hit fit, and then it will fit it appropriately to the screen, determined by the resolution. And reset backdrop, well, it's not done much in this case, but it will reset it to its default position and zoom size, etc. So I'm going to move that up to the top corner here. Okay, so we've got everything ready to start playing with, and I think it's time for a challenge. I would like you to go ahead and render your first composite. Now, I know what you're thinking, hang on a minute, Mike, you've not told us how to do this. Well, I think you already know. If you've already done a lot with the Cycles materials and blending those together, I think you'll be just fine. So it is very similar to the Cycles material setup. You will need at least 2 input nodes. Because we're compositing, we're bringing 2 things together. I would suggest in this case you keep the image, and if you've not got it in there, add back in the render layer. And the output node is a composite node, just in case you've been playing. And you will need to mix those together. There's a healthy hint as to what you will need to do. So pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. I hope you managed to do this. Let's go render our first composite over in Blender. Okay, so we have our render layer here. We've got the scene preview. Everything's all set up. And so we need to mix a render layer. If I zoom in so you guys can see what's going on, I need to mix this image here with this render layer here. Now, this is going to probably look horrible. It doesn't matter at this point. It's literally to mix these two together. So if we go ahead and add in a mix node. Now, color mix, there we go. I found the mix. Of course, you could have searched up here for mix. So we've got these 2 image inputs. Let's just mix them together. And then I'm going to Control and Shift click mix. That's because I've got Node Wrangler enabled on the add-ons. And the viewer itself, what do I want to do here? The viewer needs to be here. Oh no, the output here, viewer here, and scale needs to go to there as well so I can see what's going on. Oh no, it's just an output from here to here. I'm being daft. There we go. So what's going on here? Well, it's mixing them together and one's overriding the other. Let's just see what happens if we render that out. Does it do the same thing? Yes, so one's on top of the other. Now, can we mix them together in a way that means we can see both of them? Let's literally try some options. Well, this is the problem here. We've got the factor set at 1, so that is no good. So here we go. If we blend them together, we can start to see they come through. And there are lots of other options. And we'll get into some of those in more detail very, very soon, because we're going to have to start using multiplication and division. And you'll start to understand how do you multiply and divide an image. That makes no sense. Don't worry, we'll get to that very shortly. But if we divide, we get an interesting image. It's very bright. And again, we can play with the factor. And that's quite an interesting one. So you can play with these to your heart's content and see what you end up with. And in this case, there's our cube together. It's sort of almost superimposed. Let's render that out. So one, the other, and it's put them together. Perfect. How did you guys get on? Did you manage to composite these two images together? If you have, congratulations, well done. Please share your phantom cube, or perhaps you picked a different shape, in the discussions, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to Matching Camera Settings. So this is going to be mainly about configuring the camera. We will be setting up the camera using the settings gathered from your picture. And I will also be reiterating the importance of accurate camera data, and I'll show you why that is very important. We're going to use the text editor to store data for reference, so I don't have to keep going backwards and forwards to that information. And I'm going to start setting up a scene to match the photo. So let's go and hop on over into Blender. Right, we are back in Blender, and the first thing we need to do is open up the scene we've been working on so far. I'm going to go here and open up the introduction to compositing. I'm going to then go ahead and save as, and this is going to be my next lecture. Of course, you can name these slightly differently if you so wish. I'm going to call this one Setting Up Camera, I suppose, because that's what we're going to be doing. Save as a Blender file. I can confirm the name at the top has changed and I'm ready to go. Let's just have a look at my properties here, because I was rendering on a GPU before, so my tiles will be at the wrong size. I'm just going to save that file. Excellent, so we're ready to go. First of all, let's have a look at the camera properties. So I'm going to click on the camera to select it in the outliner, and then go down to the properties window and click on the camera tab. Once we've done this, we can have a look at a series of settings. We won't go through every single one of these. However, the important ones for us are going to be the focal length. We're going to want to leave it on perspective. That is quite important. We're going to need a focal length, and I'm going to have to look up what those details are in a few moments. Let's see down here, and camera. We'll have a look at that as well when it becomes important. So first of all, let's go ahead and set this appropriately. I don't know what it is, so I'm going to have to go and research. I'm going to open another window up and change that to a text editor. And once I've changed that to a text editor, I'm going to click on New and Camera Details. Now, if you don't have the cursor, your actual mouse cursor in that window, it will stop typing. So make sure it's over there if you're typing. Now, when I've done this, it's going to save those details along with the file. I'm going to have to go and grab my particular picture. And again, you can grab this from your assets pack if necessary. This is the picture. I'm going to go and get info from it. And we've got the details here. It's a Canon EOS 1100D. Excellent. I can cut and paste, which makes my life a lot easier. And what was the focal length? Does it say EXIF data? Focal length. Focal length 34. Now that will be 34 millimeters. That's a great start. Resolution may be important. I might as well copy it across. I think that was under general. So pixel height and pixel width. And I've got everything I need there. I'm going to grab the aperture data as well. Now, aperture is basically how large the light hole is in a lens. And the lower this aperture value, the shallower depth of field, i.e. the foreground and the background can be very blurry compared to the actual object you're actually focusing on. I don't think that's going to make a difference in this case, but I'm going to put it there so I've got the reference. And I'm going to save my file. Excellent. I've got all that data there. I'm going to keep it there for the moment, but I'm going to make this window smaller so I can get all of the data I want. I'm going to just leave it with that for the moment, and I can scroll up and down if I need to. Going back to these camera properties. Now you may think, oh excellent, we can just lower the focal length down to 34 and we're done. Not quite. We don't know the sensor size of our Canon EOS 1100D. It may or may not be 32 millimeters across. Let's have a look and see if there is a series of Canons. Oh, there is actually an 1100D built in to Blender by the looks of things. I also know that that is an APS-C sensor. If your camera is not listed on this list, which is, you know, relatively comprehensive, I know, for instance, that the Nikon here, DX format, is all of the consumer ones, the D3000, the D3001, 5000, 7000, etc. I used to have Nikons. If you've got a different camera that's on here, you will have to go and have a look at the specification sheet for your particular camera. So we know it's been taken with an 1100D, we might as well select it. And that is the camera all set up and ready to go. Again, I'm going to save my Blender file, so I'm ready to go. And let's have a look and see if it renders any differently to how it did before. Now this will be a little slower as I'm waiting for the CPU to render, and the cube does look slightly different. Now this is the important thing when setting the camera right. If we got this wrong and set this at 60, it wouldn't work once we had aligned everything in the scene. Now, for argument's sake, you can probably align something in a scene that looks absolutely fine even though it's got the wrong perspective and everything else. So that looks more in line with these ground lines. In fact, we're going to use those in a moment to try and work out scale, etc. I'm going to lower that back down to 34 because otherwise I will forget, and I'm just going to render that out once more. So we've got a cube on a ground plane in a scene, but the camera's in the wrong place. It doesn't look right. It's just floating in the sky. It's not really in contact with the ground anywhere. This is no good. We need to manipulate where the camera is. And in order to manipulate where the camera is, we're going to have to fake some of the geometry that's on the floor and get it roughly right in scale. So looking at that photo, I'm going to open up the photo. There we go. So looking at this photo, we can see there are lines on the floor. There's some guides that we can use in terms of perspective. Now, if I could read these numbers that were on here, perhaps that will give us some detail. Oh, that's not working. I don't know if these are distance markers. If I knew a bit more about runways, I could probably work out the distance between here. But we can guess, you know, that's probably going to be about 5 meters across, so 5 Blender units, and then just stretch it out into the distance. Let's go ahead and do that, and then we can position up the camera accordingly. So I'm going to delete my default. No, I'm going to lower it down. I'm going to move it on the. Oh, not got it selected properly. I'm going to move it on the Z-axis by -2. Sorry. And that is going to be 2 Blender units across, so I can scale that on the X-axis by 2.5. That's now 5 Blender units across, and then I can scale that on the Y-axis just into the vast distance. Okay, I'm going to assume that's the right width for what I'm working on. And when I look at it from the camera view, of course, that's not going to be lined up with our scene. In fact, we can render our scene really quickly and see what's going on. We're always going to have to render each time we change an actual model, but in this case, we can see that it's probably not going to be lined up right at all. No, it's not. So we need to move the camera now so those two things match. And of course, that can be very difficult without it in the foreground for you. And first of all, before we go and manipulate everything else, let's make sure you can see both of them at the same time. So to get this appearing in our view, we're going to have to go to the 3D view and then open up your properties panel, scroll down and turn on background images. We're going to add an image. Now, it should be in memory, so we should be able to pick it. Yes, we can. We can pick it from the drop down, and that's loaded in. I'm going to stick it to the foreground, and there we go, in front. Perfect. So that looks pretty much how the picture is looking before. We'll go cross-reference that in a few moments after I've set the axis of this view to just the camera view, because that's all we care about. Now, let's open up another window and make sure that these things match. So we've got one of the lines going through. Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm seeing over here. Excellent. So now I'm going to make that disappear and we can start moving the camera about. So the first thing I'm going to do here is whilst in the camera view, Shift and F so I can go into first person view, and perhaps I'll be able to get the camera in a position that makes sense. Now these are stretching away into the distance, and as you can see, I can move this around. Now it looks probably a little lower than I'm anticipating it being. Aha! Now this is trial and error, and it can take a while to do, so don't worry if you're not getting it right first time. Wow, this is going to take a little bit of manipulation to do. And of course, that's an ideal time for a challenge. I'd like you to go ahead and create your environment. If you don't know the exact camera data, this will be judgment and trial and error, especially if you don't know its actual millimeters, how wide an angle lens it is and what camera it was taken on. Now I suggest picking a scene, especially if you're new to this, that you know this information. Otherwise you're going to spend an eon trying to get to the end result. Now knowing the actual camera's position is helpful. In this particular example that I'm going through, I don't know where the photographer was stood. Now, I'm going to assume he was stood on the ground, he or she was stood on the ground, but I don't know that. They might be stood on top of a car or even in an aircraft control tower. Now, look for features that can be followed. Now, I've got some lines on the floor that I can map to a 3D model. So it should only take me a few minutes to align these good enough that I can use it for placing 3D models on or other bits of geometry. Go ahead and add a ground plane and any other objects that would have a shadow cast upon them. So if you've got a pole or a little ridge in your scene, you'll need to model those as well so it accurately is modelled. If you were modelling a window ledge, you would have to model the lip over the edge as well so that shadows, if the light is coming in from above, get cast properly over the wall. Pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. I'm going to continue now creating my environment. Now this is the stage I've gotten to so far, and I am literally going to continue now moving the camera about until I get it roughly in the right position. Now this can take quite a while to get right, you know, is it to the left, is it to the right? Do I need to move quickly or slowly to align things? And yes, this can be quite a tedious process. Now, I'm not going to bore you with this particular process. I'm going to fade out now, and I'll come back after I've faffed around for a bit and got it spot on. Okay, so I'm almost here at the moment, and I've noticed an issue that is a clipping issue. I'm quite happy with this edge is lined up, but then it kind of just stops there, and that is the camera clipping distance. So if I go into my properties, I should be able to change the view properties. Here we go, clipping at 100, or it's at 1000 at the moment. If I increase that, I should see more, and I don't. So I'm going to go to my camera clipping and scroll down here, and here we go, clipping ends at 100. So this is to do with the view itself, as in this view, which when I first created the shape I thought I had plenty of space, but the camera clipping is under the camera settings itself, and once I extend that you can see that is now going into the distance. So I'm going to set that at 1000 as well, and what that will be able to do is give you some more guidance in making sure that this is correct, and it's not at the moment. So I will see you guys back in a few moments. Okay, so welcome back, and I think I'm almost done. Now, what I've done to try and approximate my actual ground plane is I've made these pieces just a little bit thinner than they were before, and pieces, there's plural. I've created a couple of them because I think these gaps in the runway are different, or different spacing basically. So I've made a couple of them, laid them out. I seem to be getting quite a good correlation between what I can see on the camera and what I can see here. Now I think these lines actually arch away ever so slightly, so there may be a bit of distortion on the actual image itself. Now one of the things I don't have or didn't consider is the other really good line, and that's the horizon line. So I've tried to match up the end of my piece with the horizon, which I think I've done pretty accurately here. So what I should be able to do now after I've played with those things, well, first of all, I'm going to save because it took me ages to get the camera into that position. It took me about 5 or 10 minutes of faffing backwards and forwards. And I'm literally going to scale this up on the x-axis so that it fits our runway, or at least fits where the shadows and everything else are going to go. Now you can see here that it is expanding a way that I don't want it really to, but that doesn't matter. I can still move the object itself so it still lies in roughly the right place. And now I'm just going to scale that on the z-axis just a little bit more. It will go over the corner of our picture, and what happens over here in the distance, it doesn't really matter. We can see that it's slightly slanted away. I don't think that's going to cause us any issues, and if we zoom out in this sort of realm, we can see that's quite a large runway anyway, so no matter where we put an object on there, it should not matter. In fact, if there's an object right in the distance, well, to be quite honest, we're not going to really see any detail that it causes. So this is the area that we're literally going to be casting a shadow on in a few moments. So my scene's all set up and ready to go. How did you find setting up your scene? You will see that it is somewhat of a pain to try and get it right. Hence, knowing the more information about your scene, the camera, the lens that it was taken on is very important. Please share your work in the discussions, and I will see you guys in the next lecture.
Wow, what a ride. That was really exciting getting that plane flying across the scenery like that. I had lots of fun and I hope you did too. Do remember to share your work. I love seeing what you guys have come up with. And of course, if you haven't followed along exactly with me, it'd be great to see what you have done yourselves.
And don't stop there. Please take what you know of Blender and what you've learned about VFX from Mikey and do some other cool stuff. Whatever you've dreamed of, whatever compositing, whatever fake UFO sighting you want to create and create the next viral Facebook thing.
That'd be awesome.
Please do it. Please share it with us. And a great place to share is community.gamedev.tv. You guys, the Blender community, are the most active part of that community, at least when we recorded this video, and that is fantastic. You share your models, you can share them in 2D, you can share them with Sketchfab in 3D, movable models, but not
Amazing.
with VFX, of course. Video, put video in there, do what you like, but please share with other people.
Be great to see it.
Show off, make Mikey proud.
Thanks.
Welcome to extracting image data. So can we extract this shadow? There are a couple of ways that come to the top of my mind that we could do. This is a rather arduous one. We could take the background image and map it to an object that is visible in the render, but that can cause no end of issues, especially if we're animating. Things can change rather rapidly and you'd have to remap every frame. No good. There would be a better way of doing that. Now, because we have all of the 3D data to make a comparison scene, we can go about and do that. We can create another render layer for comparison without the object and therefore without the shadow as well. Now we can create just the shadow on its own. However, that can cause issues where the shadow appears on top of our plane rather than underneath it. And finally, we do need to consider the order of these layers. And by layers, I'm not specifically talking about the render layers, but we are going to have our background image, the render layer with everything on, and the render layer for comparison. So we've got those 3 layers. If we combine them in the wrong way, now there's not going to be too many permutations with 3 of them, but if we combine them the wrong way, you're not going to get the desired result. And we'll play with that and see what we get. So let's see if we can go extract that shadow and hop on over into Blender. Right, so we have our F-22 on top of the runway here, and that's looking pretty good, apart from the fact it doesn't really have any presence with there being no shadow. Now, how are we going to go about doing this? Well, first of all, let's think very carefully about how we've currently got this set up and what is really happening. So we have this image of the plane on the with a shadow, and it's being masked out by just the plane. If we have a look at that on the backdrop, we see that it's just an alpha. Anything that's just this plane will show through when we mix them together, and the black would mean that anything that's not this plane, i.e. is part of this background image, will show. And order does matter. So I'm going to get rid of the viewer there for the moment and turn off the backdrop. If we mix these up the wrong way, you end up alphaing out the background and leaving the rest of the image. So it does make a difference the way you order these. Now, when you have other mix nodes, we also have an issue with the ordering, not only of the inputs to any mix node, but also which mix node comes first. Now, because we're literally dropping this plane on last, we're saying this is the last thing to go on, stamp, we put it on top. That's also going to be the last thing we do later on. There's nothing passing in front of it, so we're okay to do that. So let's go ahead and work on the shadow. So we're going to need a comparison layer. And in order to do that, we're going to have to go over to the Render Layers tab and sort that out. By the way, I've just moved the background image down because this is the last thing to be going on. I can just move it up and out of the way. And I'm going to zoom in a little there so we can see what's going on. Now, this is also a great thing to do with multi-monitors. I'm not going to be able to show you a multi-monitor setup because you won't be able to see it on a normal screen. It would look crazy. But if you do have a multi-monitor setup, I would advise going window, duplicate window, and setting your node editor to a different window, and perhaps your this whole area here could be the picture viewer with a properties panel on the side here. But we need to create another render layer for comparison. So we've got one render layer, and I'm going to call this complete scene because that is what it is. It's not just a render layer, it is a complete scene. I'm going to add another render layer, which we're going to use for a comparison, and I'm going to call this only ground because that is what I need to compare it with. Now, there are a couple of ways of making this work. We could duplicate everything to another layer, including the lamp, and completely forget about the plane, but we don't need to do that. What we can do is shift the plane over to another layer, like layer 2. So with the plane selected, I'm going to go to the object properties here and shift it over to layer 2. It will disappear from here because in the render tab, we're not including both layers. So I'm going to hold down shift and select layer 2. So now we can see everything again. And we're working on a only ground just to make sure that is selected. So we've got only ground here, but we want to exclude, in this one, we want to exclude the plane itself, the aeroplane, not the plane on the ground. We want to exclude that. So when we render them out now, we go render and render, we won't see any difference down here just yet, but now we can have, if we have a look in this render layer, we've got this, and the complete scene is only the ground, and we've got only the ground there. Perfect. So I'm going to go back to complete scene. The other thing that we need to make sure is, well, do we need to pass through an object index? I don't think we do, so we'll leave that unchecked for the moment. If we need to do something with the object's ground and removing that from the scene, we can do, but I think we'll be okay. So we've got, we're going to have to use this render layer here and the other render layer and make a comparison between them. In order to do this, I could link this down and drag it down and plug that into a mix node, but conceptually, I'm going to keep that as a completely separate entity. So I'm going to introduce a new input, a render layer, and I'm going to duplicate that render layer. And then set one of them to complete scene and one of them to only the ground. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to be the appropriate order so that we don't have crossed wires. Does that matter? Not really. I'm going to turn on the backdrop so I can see what's going on. That's what we were looking at last. And I'm going to add in a color mix node. And I'm going to plug these two entities in. Now, if we're looking for a difference between these two layers, we can do several things to work that out. The first thing I thought was a subtract, and then we would see the difference between one layer and another. But what would be nice is if this itself created some sort of mask. This does create a mask that's kind of inverted, but it also lightens things. It lightens the shadow quite considerably. There's also a difference. So let's click on difference, and it looks exactly the same. That is the definition of subtract. After all, it's the difference between two. After playing for a bit, dividing, and with these round the other way, gave me a nice shadow, and it gave me a plane. But the plane itself doesn't really matter. The reason why it doesn't matter is because we're going to put a stamp, essentially, over the top of that. In fact, because there's a gap underneath this shadow, my whole argument about not just rendering the shadow out is now null and void because of the position of the light and everything else. So in order to make it not null and void, I'm going to actually place my plane on the ground, so there is some of the shadow which we can't see. It's underneath that plane, literally underneath. Okay, We've also got these lines going across. Let's just move this out of the way so we can focus on the picture. We've got a line scooting across here that is where that plane, i.e. the ground plane, exists. And that may cause us a problem. That's why I was thinking earlier about we might need to use an object ID just for that plane itself to remove it. But I don't know. I think we can get away with not having it. So we've divided these together and we get this image coming out. Looking good so far. We now need to put all of this back together. Now, before we actually blend anything else together, we need to blend this background image into this new mix node. So we're going to come out of here and into here and with another mix node. So let's add that in so it's ready to go. And I'm just going to plop them together. There we go. And it's not working at the moment. That's fine. We've got all the mix nodes we need in place, but we need to do some reordering. No, we don't need to do any reordering. That's all ready to go. But of course now, it's time for a challenge. It's time for the final image composite. So finish off the node setup to show the background with the object placed on it and the shadow of the object. Consider adding more light if your object is too shadowed. So you may be like me where the original lighting source in the scene is low on the horizon, as it were, and so the front is quite shadowed. And I'm going to add in a light as if it was perhaps a bit of flash photography or something along those lines. Now you may need to create another ID mask for the ground. Do give it a different pass number if you do. Sometimes it works absolutely fine. Sometimes you will need that extra ID mask. Complete the final composition and share it with us. I love seeing you guys work and everybody else likes seeing your work too. So please make sure you share your work over on the forum. Pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go complete our final image composition. So one thing at a time here, let's compartmentalize what we've got going on. So we've got this, this, and this all acting together. I'm going to put them inside a frame, and they're creating our shadow. Then we've got the background image, which is all by itself, and then we're mixing the background image and our newly formed shadow. And let's see what we get. I'm going to remove that viewer and remove the backdrop so I can see my nodes more clearly. So obviously mixing them together is not helping in this respect, and if I move them backwards and forwards, oh, I would have expected that. Oh, we've not got it plugged in either. That's silly me. Let's plug it in so we can see what's going on. So if we mix between these, we'll just get a blend between them, and that's no good. That's not what we want. We want to see all of this on top of this. Now, if we have a look at this particular image that's coming out of here, I'll just move the factor along, we've got a lot of white. If you remember earlier, I was talking about if you've got white, that's a value of 1. So if you go ahead and multiply by 1, you'll get the same background image coming out. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to test it in a moment, but I also think if any values of coming out of here greater than 1, so this pixel here that you can't really see, any of these white pixels, if they're actually greater than 1 in their value, you'll be dividing and making the image darker. Let's see if that makes any difference. So we need to multiply. Okay, so we're multiplied here, and again, it doesn't matter if we can see through our plane at the moment because we're going to stamp our plane back on. Okay, so we're multiplying. Let's clamp this divide. Okay, it's not making any difference in this particular instance, but do bear in mind whenever you're doing a division, if a value coming through turns out greater than 1, it would cause you a problem. It's not in this case, so we're fine. I'm going to leave it clamped just so it's right, so to speak, even though it doesn't seem to be making any difference. Okay, now we need to stamp this on top, so let's go ahead and link these two up and plug it in. Is that done? I think it might be. Let's swap these round. Yeah, that's definitely done. And let's just make sure we can't see through that wing. We can't. Okay. But it's still a bit dark on the front here. So what can we do? I'm going to click on my plane itself and literally add a lamp into the scene. And because we're rendering both scenes, it doesn't matter. Well, it does need to be on the same layer as our plane, ideally. Otherwise, it won't be rendered. There we go. Lamp. Add in a lamp, just a point lamp, and well, let's re-render and see what that comes out as. That's probably a little too close to our plane, so I'm going to scoot round to the top view. there's our plane. And with this, again, multi-monitors here would help massively. I'm just going to move the lamp so it's away from the plane ever so slightly. And there we go. Auto render is now kicked back in. And I'm going to turn up the intensity just a little. So we're on the lamp. We've got it selected. It's an emission, strength 100. Let's try strength 1000. And that has not updated anything. So again, I'm going to move the lamp by nothing. And there we go. That's better. It's highlighted the front of our plane. And of course, you can move that into different positions to give it a different lighting effect. I'm going to move it slightly over to the side, so we've got more light coming in from the side, just highlighting those edges. And then we've got a nice shadow around the edge there. I'm liking that. Let's do something funky inside our plane. You don't have to do anything like this, of course. I'm going to have a look. Let's select the plane and use pad 0 and go into perspective mode. I'm just going to select inside that air intake and add another lamp. This is just for fun. I'm going to set that lamp to have, I don't know, a blue color. Does that, let's re-render it. Does that work? Cool. It doesn't need to have a strength of that, maybe a little less. Let's re-render. Let's go a little less once again. It's a shame that it doesn't auto-render at this point. That is a little bit annoying. Let's just try a strength of 5. There we go. A nice blue glow coming from it. Realistic? No. Cool? Yeah. Why not? Let's do orange. Let's see how orange comes out. Yeah, it's probably a little better. Okay, this is really noisy at the moment, and we need to be careful of is we don't override our blooming shadows that we had here before. Let's go ahead now and turn up the render details. I'm not going to bother with it being super high resolution. In fact, I'm going to make it lower, but I am going to turn up my samples now. I'm going to turn them up to 50 and re-render. So we've got our shadow there and combined. That's very subtle. That does have a subtle shadow. I don't think the shadow itself is strong enough in this case. I really don't. So there's a couple of options we can do there because I don't want to lose the highlighting on my plane. The first thing I can do is try moving that away perhaps so the light that's highlighting the plane isn't so close. Maybe it's too close to the ground. Where is our spotlight? Let's lift that up a little. Okay, that's still not doing exactly what I wanted. Let's go to our sun lamp and increase its intensity because it's at 5 at the moment. Let's just try 50. And once again, I'm going to move this by 0. I could have hit F12 as well. Ah, interesting. We've now got a highlight round our plane that's not very nice. So I'm going to turn that back down to 5. I don't like that at all, and I'm going to re-render. So there's some fun to be had here. We have got a shadow over the back here. I don't think the shadow... I need to move this around, I believe, or make it weaker and closer. So I'm going to go 100 and move it around. Again, this is now playing with the scene. There we go. That's a bit better. I'm happy with that. And it's time to render that out in full and see what it looks like. In fact, I'm going to also go ahead and add some materials to this plane so it doesn't look so dull. And I'll see you guys back in a moment with the full render. Okay, so as I was playing about here with the F-22, I've just added a glass cockpit, or I was about to, and I was just literally playing about. I added a transparent, which is right at the top here, and I rendered that out, and all of a sudden, it went like this. So it does look like we need to exclude the ground plane in our renders. So we need to go ahead, let's hop out here, select our ground plane, and give it an index pass different to our plane, and go in and add it into the appropriate place. So it's going to be coming out of this put my teeth back in, index OB, and I'm going to add that in, converter ID mask. I'm going to pop that in there, and there we go, that's in. So we're going to take this out, and now we've not got all of this set up quite yet. We do need to render. In fact, we need to make sure only the ground has the object index because that's the one we want. Excellent. Now we just need to re-render before we do anything else. So we've got an alpha layer here. Let's just check and see what that looks like. Excellent. So we need to plug that in where it goes wonky. Does it go wonky here? Maybe. Does it go wonky here? I think it does. So we plug that into the factor and then swap these round. Ooh, this is an odd one here. Ah, we've not got the index pass set to 2. Okay. Aha, that is looking much better now. Excellent. I hate it when I forget to flick that index mask to the right value. Excellent, that's me done. I'm going to render this out now as my final scene. So I'm going to turn up. I'm only going to render it at 1080p, and I'm also going to turn up the render samples here to 200, and then just hit render and wait for a bit. It will take a while to render out. And there we go. Excellent. This has turned out much better than I thought it was going to do, which is brilliant when that happens. How did yours come out? Did you use the same scene and plane as me? Or did you do something else? I'd love to see your work, and so would everybody else. So please make sure you'll share your work over on the forum. And I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to Mathematics and Images. So in this lecture, we're going to learn how maths works in images, and it can be difficult to comprehend at first. If maths is not your strong point, do not worry. We are going to be doing some very basic maths, nothing too arduous. Now, if you think about how a computer is showing you an image, it is a series of values. Each pixel of an image will have a certain red, green, and blue value. Initially, we're going to focus on monochrome or grayscale, and that is where the red, green, and blue channels, so color is generated from those three channels, have the same value. Now, if they all have a value of 0, then you get a black image. They all have a value of 1 or 100%, or if the slider goes up to 255, then you will have a white image, and anything in between where all the values are the same for red, green, and blue, you'll end up with some shade of grey. Now, each pixel on an image will have its own values. However, to keep things simple, we will have one value for all the pixels of our image. Now, basic mathematics is just that. We're not going to do a deep dive into all the mathematical functions that are available to us. We're literally going to be adding, subtracting, dividing, and multiplying. These are all just as you would expect them to be when you combine them together. So 1 plus 1 is 2. It is as simple as that. Now, you can build things up to make them more complicated, or not necessarily more complicated, but more functional, but they are just simple stepping stones. Now, it is important that we understand that values of less than 0 or greater than 1 are still passed through the system unless we use a clamping feature. We will also see that the color mix and converter math nodes function almost the same. However, there are different options. They've both got add, subtract, divide, and if you use them, you're going to get exactly the same result if you leave everything as standard. We'll have a quick look at that. But when you're dealing with images, it's probably best to use just the mix node. So let's go play with some basic mathematics now and hop on over into Blender. Right, so we're over in the default blend file, and this is all we need to do our compositing test. There is one thing I want to do and demonstrate for you, and which will be one of the differences between a mix node and a math node. We need to have a bit of color in our image, because if we render out that cube, it is just grey. So I'm going to go and change the diffuse color of my cube to red or yellow, or pick a color you like. Excellent, and I'm going to render that out. Now that that's rendered out, we can go straight into the compositing setup. So we can see our 3D view, our image, which isn't quite going yet, and our node editor. And because we're in the compositing view, our node editor has also been switched over to the compositing mode. I'm going to put a tick in use nodes. I'm going to put a tick in backdrop, which won't do anything at the moment because we don't have the appropriate output node. And I'm also going to turn on auto render. And what auto render will do is if we change anything in our scene, it will automatically re-render it. Now, I don't want it taking however long that's going to take, 5 seconds every single time. So I'm going to turn down my samples to 1 when I hit render. And now if I move that cube, it updates nice and quickly. Of course, it's not going to be very high def or anything along those lines. I'm also going to be a bit pernickety here and turn my lamp to a sun lamp. This is one of these things that I've lost with a setting of maybe 2. Now, nothing's changed in that render. and it won't automatically update unless something else in our scene has changed. I could move the lamp, I could rotate it. I can't do it from this view, however. So if I go ahead and move the lamp, now when I go back to our compositing view, it should all be updated, he says. Is it not? There we go. We have to move it in this case. That's all sorted. You can, by the way, instead of moving it like that and actually potentially destroying your setup, you can move it by 0 and it will also update. Worthwhile knowing. So the final thing here is we can't see what's going on. We need another output node, so we're going to add in an output that's a viewer. Then when we plug the image into that as well, we can see it in the background. So we can see an update in 2 different places. Now this is a great way of trying out changes, or in this case just sampling areas. I'm going to turn that off for the moment so that our background's nice and clear, and I'm also going to get rid of the viewer node just to keep things simple. So let's have a look. I'm going to unplug that for the moment, so this will go black because nothing is being rendered. And we've got a color mix. So you can go add color mix or add converter math. Let's look at these side by side. They're very similar in what they do, but they have different inputs and different outputs. So they both have a series of options, i.e. the function it's going to perform. And these are more maths orientated and these are more image orientated. Now the inputs, we've both got a clamp here. The inputs, I'm going to skip the factor for the moment. The inputs themselves are taking in 3 values. That's why they are coloured in yellow. And the output is going to output 3 values. Now the inputs here are just taking in 1 value and outputting 1 value. So if we link all of these together in this order and make sure these are set to multiply, and the reason I'm going to set them to multiply is I'm going to set this to a value of 1. And the bottom one here is white, so that's also 1. So when we multiply by 1, we get the same output. And I'm going to plug the image in to here, the top node there, and I'm going to plug the value, this image output of the multiply, into here, and then finally the viewer across as well. And what we should get is a black and white image, because it's taking the average of the 3 outputs here and then outputting only 1. So that's essentially made this grayscale for us if we wanted to. Now, for the rest of this particular tutorial, I am not going to use the math node, just to demonstrate it does exist, and if you're just processing a single value, in fact it would work very well with just grayscale images, you can use the math node. Otherwise, I'd recommend using the mix node, because it's all about mixing images. Let's plug that back in and make sure everything's working. Perfect. Okay, so we need to deal with something just a little simpler, just so we can get the hang of things. I want to get rid of the render layer input and add in another type of input, which is a value. And I'm going to duplicate that so I have 2 of them. So now, if we have our multiply here, if we multiply 0.5 and 0.5 together, we get a value that should be the same, and we can test it. If you keep your eyes down here, I'm going to create another value node and set it as 0.25 and plug that straight into our image, and it should look no different. Excellent. So that's working well. I'll get rid of that extra value input. Now let's have a look at what happens if we add 1 and 1 together. Well, that's 1 and 11. Let's add 1 and 1 together. And add, we get a white image. But because we haven't clamped, the values coming out of here are 2 on both the RG and B channels. And we can test that by duplicating our mix node. And this time, let's make this number larger. Let's make it 9. So we've got a total of 10 coming out. So if we divide 1 by 10, we should get, I'm surprised that came out white. Oh, we're still adding. Divide. There we go. We get a dark, dark grey. If we clamped that, it doesn't matter what these values coming in will be, because it will clamp the value at a maximum of 1 or 255 on each of the RGB channels. And clamping, there we go, it's gone white. Excellent. So we've got a good grasp here of our node setups and how the mix node can be used. There are lots of other options. We won't be dealing with them quite at this moment in time, but you've got your multiplies, and as I've already stated, if you multiply something by 1, you get the same thing coming out. That's worthwhile knowing if you're mixing masks together. And we've got the factor slider here. Very important if you want to have 100% influence of, well, let's see if we can do this. Let's go ahead and add in that render layer again. So input, render layer. I know that's getting a bit small there, so I'll zoom back in. So we have an image here that we can use as a factor. And at the moment, we're adding these two different images together, one of 9 and one of 1, which will both be white. If we have, let's say we add in 0.1 and 0.5 and see if that's made any difference as it comes through. I'm going to get rid of this divide as well. So we just dealing with the 1. And there we go. We can actually see the cube. It's not that strong, probably because of the colors I've picked. Let's play with these values here. So they're being added together. There we go, we can see the image a little better now. So we can see that we're using this image here, not the best image as a mask, for these two colours coming through. If we pick one of the other options, we get different results. In fact, you can go through and play with these and see what results you get and how it affects an image. Now, obviously, at the moment, with these two values coming through, the output will always be grey until we get colour coming through, and then you will get a different effect. Now, one of the things to just be aware of is if we have a value of 1 and a value of 0, let's just delete the render layer to make things simple again, and we set this to mix. Mixing is the one that's not really explained very well because it's not saying average. But the factor down here can be very confusing. So a factor of 1 means that it's weighted towards this bottom one completely. A factor of 0 means it's weighted towards the top one. So this can be very confusing. If you want a pure average between the two, you're going to have to put in 0.5. And then the average of 1 and 0, well, you add them together and divide them by the total number you have. So you will end up with 0.5. Now I'm going to test my theory here by making another value node, putting in 0.5 and just linking it across and seeing if there's any change in the image. There's not. So that just confirms that a factor of 0.5 when you're mixing will average the two inputs. Excellent. Now we've got a handle on using image and maths together. It's time for a challenge. And your challenge is, what is the output value? Now this is going to be quite straightforward mathematics. If you're experienced with mathematics, you may even find this a real doddle. But what I'd also like you to do, as well as giving the answer, is what the shade of grey will be, or whether it will be black or white. And do compare that over in Blender as well, and make sure what you think the answer results in is what happens. So what happens if you add 0.5 and 0.5 together? What happens if you subtract 1 from 0.5? If clamped, what does adding 0.5 and 1 result in? What happens if you multiply 0.5 and 0.5? What happens if you multiply 0 by 1? What happens if you divide 0.5 by 1? And what happens if you divide 0.5 by 0.5? Pause the video now, go through those, answer them, and do check over in Blender if the colour output that you thought would happen is what happens. Okay, welcome back. Let's go have a look at the answers. So, giving an answer and what the shade of grey will be, or of course if it's black or white. So what happens when you add 0.5 and 0.5? Well, you get 1, which will turn out to be white. What happens when you subtract 1 from 0.5? You'll get minus 0.5, which is black, because we've gone to 0 and we can't really go beyond it. If clamped, what does adding 0.5 and 1 equal? Well, that equals 1 because it's clamped, so it can't go any higher than 1. If you added 1,000,000 and 1 together, you would still get the answer 1, and that would also be white. Now, what does multiplying 0.5 and 0.5 together? You'll get a 0.25 together, which will be a darker grey than you had initially. What does multiplying 0 by 1? Well, multiplying anything by 0 is always 0. Now, you do have to be cautious about this, because if you've got something in your scene that is 0 and you're not using it as a mask, it will cancel out colours, especially when multiplying, and you'll result in black. And of course, as we've experienced in the past, nothing in the real world, except maybe a black hole, is truly black. So do be very cautious if you ever end up multiplying something by 0, unless it's a mask. Now, dividing 0.5 by 1. Well, you get 0.5, which is a mid-level grey. And then finally, 0.5 by 0.5, if you divide them, you get a value of 1, which is white. How did you guys get on? Did you find this straightforward? It is pretty basic maths, but when you think about how it relates to colours, sometimes that can be a little confusing. Remember to play with the sliders, see if you can get a bit of an intuition for it. Share your work and discussions and anything you've discovered over on the forum, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to Overlaying Images. We need to consider what are our layers when we're sticking everything together. One of the obvious ones is the background image, and that has to be visible. In fact, that is the base of our entire project. Then we've got the object itself. This is the item we're using CGI, we're generating this on our computer, and then we're merging it with the real world image. That also has to be visible. Now at the moment, we're blending the two things together, and we're kind of getting... well, the object isn't isolated, and we're getting this blend between the two, so we need to sort that out. We're going to have a shadow eventually, and that also needs to be visible. However, the ground itself used for capturing the shadow needs to be hidden. So let's have a look now at how we can isolate the object by itself and give that some thought, and also how we can go about isolating the shadow by itself, or whether we need to do something else with the shadow as well. Before we go over into Blender, let's grab a pen and paper and work out the layers of our image. Let's go ahead and think about what we want. So at the end, we want a composite image, a composition, that has our mountains or whatever your image is in the background, an object, and a shadow that looks like it's being cast onto the actual surface. And we've got a fake ground plane that we can use there, which we don't want visible in the final scene. How are we going to do about that? Well, let's have a look at our components. What's making up this scene? We've got a background, and that pretty much goes all the way to the end, and there's something happening here before we render, and that's going to be our sort of final combination node, if you will. And this is just conceptual at the moment. We're trying to work out how to piece together our image. Now, we can render our entire scene at once, which is an object, the ground plane it sits on, and a shadow. Okay, so that's something else we can work with. Now, we could render the shadow by itself. Now, if we have a look at what would happen in reality, is there would be a shadow cast underneath an object that's too close to the floor. So I'm going to extend the shadow up to the top of the plane there just to demonstrate that. And then finally, we can do the plane itself, or the ground, whatever we're doing. And with these, we've got pretty much every combination we can use to work things out. Now, the problem with this one here, so I'm going to just circle it in red for a moment. Problem with this one here is it would actually, if we overlaid it, unless we started doing something funky, we would have a shadow over the top of our object when we combine them. So we don't want to do that. So I'm just going to remove those bits there, and we'll decide at this point that we do not want to use that particular image. Additionally, we have to consider the render time implications. Say each one of these three images took the same time to render. I doubt they would, but let's just say for argument's sake they do. Then that middle one that we've decided to exclude potentially could save us 33% of our render time, which, if it's an animation, is going to be a lot of render time. So when we can avoid rendering, that is a good thing, because it will save us a lot of time. Even if you decided at the end to render your composite image at a high resolution, you're still going to have to render all of these out first. So that's a good time-saving tip there. So that leaves us with these combinations, and we need to do something with them. We don't know quite what it is at the moment, but what do we need to get? We need to get the object by itself, and we need to get the shadow by itself. But, and I'll just draw a harsh line there, the shadow has to be occluded by the actual object. So we've got the object by itself, and I will just do a dash here as if it was alphaed out, an image just by itself. And once again here, we would have an alphaed out image. So how do we get this? Well, we can certainly just extract the object from here. So something will happen here, which will get that, and then we can combine that towards the end. I'm going to do a plus there. I don't know whether it will be an addition or a multiplication or something. In fact, what would be better, of course, would be an equals, some sort of maths going on that would equal that. And again, this question mark is really an equals. What do we do here that equals that? And then finally, we've got the shadow all by itself, but occluded by the object. So we have the object up here, and we have the plane just here, and the difference between those will be an occluded shadow. And so there's going to be something else happening when we combine these things together. So there's 3 distinct groups here. We've got this background group with something happening in it. I'm just going to make that a bit bigger green. So something happens with this background group, and then it gets passed onwards. We've also got this group here, and then something gets passed onwards. And then finally, we've got a third group. I'm just going to do it in a different color so it stands out. This group here. So these things themselves, I say group, they can be compartmentalized and then reused if necessary. Now, it will depend on the scenes you're doing, but we can see here how putting them all together, we've got 3 distinct groups. So we've got 3 levels of what's known as abstraction. That we've got a lot of detail going in here, but we can zoom out and make these modules much more easy to follow and much easier to read as well. Looking at this diagram in front of us, we've pretty much done this first one. If we just link it in, we get the background image. And we're kind of there with this one at the moment. We've got the background, the actual cube showing, but it's affecting the entire image and not having the cube itself isolated. So let's go ahead now and look at that and hop on over into Blender. Okay, so I've gone ahead and opened up the scene we were working on before, and we were setting up the camera and the fake ground plane to cast the shadow on, and I'm liking what I see so far, and I've renamed the file so I don't overwrite the old one. Now I'm going to immediately append an object into my scene. I've gone on to Blend Swap and I've modified an F-22 Lightning. It's an aeroplane. So let's go ahead and append it into our scenes. And you can also use this if you're doing a runway and following along. F-22 Lightning, we'll just import that. We'll go to Object. Oh, if I go click Happy, there we go. F-22, append from library. And I'm going to move that now towards the camera. And there we'll do. It's in the ground, so let's just lift it up so it's not. Perfect. Now, because I've set everything up so it's all level, I can actually whiz round to the front view in orthographic mode, zoom in and make sure it's not actually in the ground. So it would be hovering about there. This plane does not have wheels. Never mind. So let's go ahead now and whiz back round to the camera mode. Make sure it's roughly in the right position. I'm going to shift it across just a little. Okay, we've got an object and we want to isolate it from the background. Let's render what we've got so far. And again, looking at this, the lighting is not right and it's going to take too long. So I'm going to scroll down, go to sampling and turn the render down to 1, so that will speed up that. And finally, let's sort out our lighting as well. So I've got the lamp in the scene. It's blatantly not a sun lamp at the moment, so let's make it a sun lamp. For argument's sake, it doesn't matter with a sun lamp, but I'm going to move it so it's over the sun. And then the little line that comes out to show you the direction, I can manipulate that so that it is facing towards us. So let's go ahead and open up the properties panel, and we've still got our lamp selected. And I'm going to change the rotation to 0, 0, 0. And I'm going to come out for a moment and see that that is facing directly down. Now, I don't want it facing directly down. I want it towards our plane, which is over here. And so I think I need to rotate it around the x-axis, by the looks of it, by -90. He hopes. Yes, that's right. And now I just need to move it towards the camera as well. So I can go back to this view and literally by manipulating, not the Y, the Z axis, let's try 10. Yeah, that's moving it towards, so we need positive. So now it's definitely towards us. That is quite hard to see, but the little line, if I exaggerate it, moving away, moving towards. And because it was roughly towards us to begin with, I know it is moving towards, not away from. Finally, the rotation, well, the sun isn't pointing directly over there. I'm going to make it face down slightly, maybe 85. And let's just render that now and see what we get. That's not the desired result. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of that backdrop because we need to focus on one thing at a time. If you put too many things into your pot, you won't be able to. We need to isolate the flavors. So we need to isolate these two parts of our image. So I'm going to switch immediately over to the compositing node and let's have a backdrop turned on. Oh, no, let's not have the backdrop. Let's just use the window down here and auto render turned on. Let's render our image out. Perfect. We're using nodes and you may get this happen to you occasionally where you're using nodes and no nodes appear. Switch to the shader and switch back to your compositing node and it should all come back. So as I was detailing earlier, we need to isolate some of these components so they don't get in the way, and you can't go back and touch them either. That's a rule. You can, naughty, you can't do that. So I'm going to select these two here and make them into a group. And by making them into a group, I'm going to come out, and it's called node group. That's no good. I'm going to call it background image. We know that works. Or just background will be fine for the moment. We know that works. We don't need to play with it. Let's get rid of it completely from our setup for the moment. And we've got this multiply here. I'm going to leave that. I think we're going to need multiply at the end. I don't know. So with nothing plugged in, we can't see what's going on. Let's delete the multiply and if we need it, we'll pop it back. And I'm going to link up that to not the viewer, the composite. There we go. And I'm going to get rid of the viewer because I can always bring that back in with Node Wrangler if I need to. Excellent. So we have our render layer here. I'm still not happy with that. The lamp itself, have I actually set the lamp up? I don't think I have. I moved it. I made it into a sun. I didn't use nodes and I didn't turn up the strength to maybe 5. Let's switch to rendered mode to see what's going on in the 3D view. Okay, we've got a shadow there and it looks like it's facing the right direction. And so I want this shadow to be a bit tighter and this size will make it basically diffuse the shadow. And if we set that to 0, we get a really harsh shadow. That's also not what I desire. 0.01. There you go, we've got a bit of fuzz there. Let's try 0.05. Excellent. I like how that is coming out. Let's hop back over into the compositing layout. Compositing, there we go. Now, something's taking a while to render in the background. Let's just make sure everything's set up. Sampling, renders 1, that's fine. I'm happy with how this is here, and we've got auto render. Let's go ahead and work out how we can isolate this. In fact, that doesn't look like it has rendered out. There we go, now it has. What have we got to do? We need to isolate the object itself. And because it's an object in our scene, we can give that object an ID and then isolate it via that ID. Let's go back and open up. Well, we've got the 3D view here. We don't need to open anything else up. I've got the F22 selected and I can go into its object properties. And here I can give it a parse index under the relations. You can move it onto a different layer if you wanted to. You can do that from here. That's another way of doing that. And you can set a parent object and you can give it an identity. And I'm going to set that to 1 and just re-render and see what happens. Nothing looks any different. Brilliant. We haven't upset the rendering gods, as it were. So the next thing to do here is be able to pull that information from our render layer, and it's not turned on at the moment. So we need to go to our render layers and go down, and under passes, there's a load more options. In this case, we want the object index. If we go ahead and select that, we can see that we get index object coming out. Okay, that's a good start. Now, how do we mask off this particular F22? Well, we need to add in a node that's a converter and an ID mask. So it's masking off a particular index number, and here an ID value. Well, we need to give it the entire scene data, so let's plug in the index object, and there we go. Let's preview this. I'm going to use Node Wrangler again. I could plug that into the viewer, which I've deleted, but I'm going to use Control and Shift and click on that, and we should see, if I turn backdrop on, what's happening. And we get a white image. We've not got it set to 1, so let's go ahead and set it to 1. Oh, now we get a black image. What is going on here? Now, because we didn't have this set up on the render layers yet, it hasn't actually been included. The node has it all set up, but it has not been output yet. It's not stored that data. So it's null at the moment or nothing. So let's go ahead and re-render our scene. And there we go. We have a mask isolating just the object. Brilliant. And of course, that leads us nicely on to a challenge. I would like you to go ahead and render the background and the object together. So finish off the node setup to show the background with the object placed upon it. You'll need to use the ID mask to show parts of the rendered image you'll want to see. Pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go set up the nodes now and hop on over into Blender. Right, so we have a mask set up here that we can use. Let's bring back in our background layer. Did I delete it? No, I just hid it out of the way. You probably won't be able to see this, so I'll zoom back in. There we go. Now I found that background layer. And we've got a viewer here. I don't need the viewer. It's just going to get in the way of this backdrop. So I'm going to remove that entirely. And I also want the render to automatically update. So what did we have before? We had a mix color mix node. So we need to mix these two images together. We know that. In which order? Ooh, interesting. Well, if we just mix them 50-50, that's not going to work. But we're going to have to do something with the ID mask here. I think it is mix we need, because we need, again, this weighting here is an average of the two. However, if we control the weighting, so let's just bring that back in. If we bring the weighting of 100% of only this image, so that'll be the factor of the bottom one. So I think that's the right order. Yeah, I think so. This will be a factor of 100%, thus showing us all of what's under this image. And then the black will be nothing of this image and therefore show all of the background. Let's plug it in and see what happens. Oh, excellent. How about that? It's all come together rather nicely. I'm going to just get rid of my backdrop again so we can see the node set up. Let's see what we've got. Let's see if we can group things together into their compartments. So this is like an end mix node at the moment, and we have the composite at the end. So that's fine. That's our end point. We've got a viewer here. I can just get rid of that. So we have our ID mask and our render layers. Now, I would like to group these two together. Sometimes it's a bad idea to group inputs together, but if you do try and group these together, if we go node and make a group, Blender will complain. We can't shove a render layer into a group. And I'm not going to go about and this ID mask here, I'm not going to shove that into a group just yet, but this is isolated our object. The issue I've got with this, of course, is it's a different layer to this background. So this is all one particular group. So we could visualize that in a different way if we wanted. We could put a little frame around it. So let's go and do that now. Let's select both of these and add a frame. So I'm going to select those two as done and Shift and P. It will pop a frame around it. I'm happy with it left as the default colors. It just demonstrates that that is its own entity. It also means we can move them both around together. Excellent. How did you guys get on? I hope you've managed to render your object over the top of your photo, your scene. Of course, we can get to making that look a bit better later on. We just need to get the components right first. Now, I did say I didn't want to name this, didn't want to color in this frame, but I will name it. So with it selected, I'm going to go over to label here and call it Object Isolation. Isolator or isolation? Let's call it isolate. Let's put the verb at the front. I've spelled that completely wrong. Isolate object. And I'm going to use camel case, which is where you just capitalize with no spaces. Isolate object. And then, isn't that brilliant? Let's turn up the label size so we can read it. There we go. Isolate object. Perfect. How did you guys get on? Remember to share your work over in the discussions on the forum, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to the CGI VFX final scene. Very excited because we're going to bring this all together now. So this is going to be initially all about getting everything ready. We're going to import assets that you wish to use in your scene. Adjust your camera's view if it's slightly out, and you'll see what I mean about that in a few moments. And then finally, get the ground ready for shadows. So let's go get everything ready now and hop on over into Blender. So we have the cube in our scene and it's mapped out relatively well. I'm happy with all of that. One of the first things we should do is just make sure that these sort of empties, these little crosses that are on the scene, are actually in the right place in our world, and that they are all on the ground. Now, I can pretty much guess with some degree of accuracy that this whole thing is flat. And if it is all flat, all of these should exist on the same point. So let's whiz round and check this out in orthographic projection and from the side. So we should find that all of these line up, and they don't. All of these are slightly tilted, as we can see. One empties up the top here and the others are below. Now they're going to be scattered about ever so slightly. However, what we can do is rotate the camera. So make sure you've got the camera selected. Rotate it on its x-axis. And let's just bring it up so they're all roughly level. That's good. And then just bring it down ever so slightly to the y-axis. And I'm just going to rotate that on the x-axis just a little bit more. And I'm happy with how all of those are laid out. We can also just check for any sideways motion as well from the other way, but that looks pretty much straight. Now the camera is definitely and fully set up so that these empties are crossing through the ground plane. Now the cube itself, that can go completely, and this ground plane here, this is what we're going to use for our shadows. So let's make sure that's scaled up appropriately to capture any shadows of our models. Now I'm going to have to toggle the ground on and off. I'm going to be wanting to place a plane there on the runway. So I'm going to go ahead and append. I'm going to go ahead and find the, where is it? Section 10, Assets, Models, F22 Lightning, Object, F22. Wow, it's huge. That is no good. Well, first of all, let's make sure it's located in the right place in our scene, and then scale it accordingly. So I'm going to whiz round, and to the side, it's going to have to be there. And if we look at it in 3D space, it'll have to be there. And it's going to have to be lifted up ever so slightly. Let's see what that looks like in the scene. That is a wee bit large. Oh, don't want to hide that. I want to hide this. And now we can rotate it locked to the Z-axis that's pointing down our runway. And then we'll just scale it down accordingly. Now, as you scale it, it's going to scale away from the plane itself. So I'm going to set the pivot point to the 3D cursor. Then it should scale towards the 3D cursor. I didn't start with the mouse far enough away, so I didn't have very granular control. And I'm going to make sure that it's semi-realistic in terms of its size. And I can go ahead and start animating that as well. And one of the ways that you can animate to make sure things work out well is whiz round to the top. And we've got a set here. Now, I don't know where the end of the runway is, so before I do anything else, I can go back round to the camera view. And let's add in a keyframe. So at the beginning, it's going to be where it currently is. So let's go to frame 1, or in this case, frame 2. Key in the location and rotation data. Now, as the camera pans round, it's going to come into view. And by the time it's at frame 40, I expect it to be at least at the end of the runway. So I'm going to move it, but only on the y-axis. But I'm going to press the y-axis again, so we're moving it along its own y-axis. I can move that to the end of the runway and press I and I again. And now, as we play it back, we will see it moving along the runway. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is that all of these movements will be naturally S-curved, so it will slow down between each keyframe, and that can produce something very unnatural. To get around that, you would need to switch to the graph editor, as we've done in the past. Instead of having these nice smooth transitions with the handles, in this case just along the y-axis, well, you can adjust those handles if you want, or indeed go to the handle type, hit V and make it a vector type. That will work as well. In fact, you can select everything and hit V and go to vector. And that kind of makes things nice and linear to work with. Not very good for organic movements or perhaps things that naturally need to slow down or you need curves to control them. But for setting up scenes like this can be handy to have things moving linearly so they're not sort of slowing and speeding up. Because once a plane starts going, it's not going to suddenly slow to turn a corner. It can't do that very easily. So there's lots more to do in terms of moving things along and setting up nodes. And now it is time for your final challenge in this section. It is time to finish your scene. Set your samples and resolution low. This will speed up your workflow a lot. I can't impress as much as possible, as you don't want to wait around for ages to get samples going. Create any animations you want to use. I've got a little bit more to go with mine. As you're going through, check your animations are good. At this stage in the course, we really want the plane, if you're doing a plane or whatever you're animating, we really want it to look like it's part of the scene and not separate. Set up your nodes as per the still image. Remember, a movie is simply a series of still images played back one after the other. Now, when you go to your nodes and go to your compositing node, what you'll see is there's already something already set up. Now, in this case, you could use that to move forward. However, I would recommend deleting what's currently there and setting it up afresh so you get the hang of putting these things together. Finally, up those samples, up that resolution, and render your final scene and share. Pause the video now and give that a go. Wow, okay guys, welcome back. How did you get on? Well, it's time for me to go in and go through the stages I've done to finish off my scene. So let's hop back on over into Blender. Okay, so this is my scene so far. I will just make this a bit larger so I can show it to you guys. And so, I'm failing in pressing the right keys on the computer. That doesn't help. So I'm just going to turn off the ground plane here so we can see what's going on. So we've got the planes coming in from the side, this plane taking off, and then these planes will bank away as the final move. Looking good. Now, the first thing we need to make sure is just what happens when we go and render our scene. We get the movie. And I do mean the movie, because on the video sequence editor, we've still got our timeline, our video here, playing. We're not going to use that at the moment in combination with the composite editor. So I'm literally just going to remove that from our scene and save my work. Now I've done that, when we go back over and go and render our scene, we kind of almost get a result, but it's really horrible. First of all, I'm going to make sure I've got CPU rendering turned on, which I have done. 10% of 4K, that's fine. And what have we got down here in terms of samples? Sampling, I'm going to up my render to 5. So I've just got a little more detail. Let's go for F12 as we come through. That's fine. Let's go to a place where we should be able to see more of the planes. Okay, so something's going on. It's not quite right. That's fine. I wasn't expecting it to be working straight away. Let's go have a look at the node editor. Whoa, I haven't created that, but it's been kindly added in for me. Bit confusing? Yes. So rather than going through and trying to recreate all of this lot, or rather move it around so it all fits, I'm going to remove the bits that I know are at the moment just rubbish. So let's get rid of that. This undistortion, I'm not going to need that. However, I will want the scale, just like we had before with the single image. This time it's for the movie. We want the render size to be fine, yep, and we want it to fit. So it doesn't matter what size scene we have, it fits our scene. What size resolution we have here, it automatically scales accordingly. So that's the top bit done, and we've got one render layer sorted here and the other one is not. Let's go have a look at the render layers. So we've got foreground and background. That is not that intuitive, but what we certainly don't know is where things are situated at the moment. So we've got our ground plane, which is going to take our shadows. Let's turn that on. There we go, we've got shadows. So we've got our ground plane here, and that is on layer 10. Fine, everything else is also on layer 10. So we need to move the ground plane to a different layer. I'm simply going to move it to layer. Oh, it's on both layers, is it? That's interesting. Let's move it to just layer 1 for the moment. Perfect. So now we have that on layer 1. We've got our planes on layer 10, all of them, I believe. Yep. Now we need to give them a pass index. I've set my planes to a pass index of 1. So I can isolate them. So that's all sorted. And we've got the ground plane here. So the final thing is on the render layers to set up the foreground and background. Foreground and background doesn't really make any sense. So I'm going to call it whole scene and just ground. So we can have the difference between the two and work it out from there. Now we're going to have everything on here turned on and here. We're not going to mask anything off, so let's turn that off. Excellent. So on the whole scene, we have everything rendered, and there's just 2 layers, so the scene rendering's fine. On the just ground, we want to exclude layer, whatever layer this is layer 10. Okay, finally, let's have a look at the lamp. It's not a sun lamp, and I'm going to have hard shadows, one slightly softer than hard shadows, but there we go, slightly fuzzy shadows, but that's it for the moment because I want the effect to be quite strong. That looks fine to me. Let's go and hit render and see how that comes out. Well, it won't come out as anything at the moment. Why won't it come out as anything? Well, let's have a closer look at the node editor. And let's switch this back across to node. So at the moment, nothing is plugged into the output. Do we have an output? Yes, we have 2. I'm going to border select those and move them. Oh, I didn't mean to move everything, but it looks like I have. Move them in so we can see what's going on. Now, I'm not going to use a backdrop here because I'm going to find it hard enough to see stuff as it is. But if we plug in the render layers into the composite, it auto renders. We have that back out. Excellent. So now it's just a matter of setting up a similar settings as we had before. Now notice down here we're missing index objects, so we need to go back into our render layers and on the passes do the object index and object index. We don't need the vector output, and on this one we've got some extra things as well. We don't need those, and then we re-render after we've done that. Right, this should be ready to go and ready to link together. Let's go ahead and do that. Right, nodes. These can always be a challenge to get right. I'm not going to use my viewer. I am going to use the composite node. I'm going to leave this as a 3D image editor, and we need to render. We haven't rendered yet, so let's go ahead and render. Excellent. So we've got our planes and we've got just the ground itself as well. I'm going to swap them round. Okay, so we're going to have to take index object IDs from the ground and the planes. I'm not sure if I've done the ground, so let's just have a look at the ground's settings. Okay, it's not got anything, so we'll set it with the ground with a pass index of 2. Let's bring in the items I know we need. So I need an ID mask, and that is going to help us isolate the ground when we mix in the image after we've isolated the shadows, or what the difference is between the two. And that's going to be an index of 2 because that's the ground. Let's move that to one side. I'm jumping ahead of myself. We need to combine these two together. So I'm going to add a color mix, and we're going to add them together. Can you add by dividing? We're going to combine them with division. I'm going to put the image is in, and the output that we get from here, I'll plug it straight into the composite to have a look, should be bright white with anything that's exactly the same, because anything divided by anything exactly the same is 1, and any difference will actually be highlighted. That's a great start. So we've isolated the shadow, and we've also isolated the planes themselves, kind of, but we're going to mask off the planes in a few moments. Let's now mix in our next bit. So we've got this coming in. We're going to have an ID mask here, and we're going to bring in our image itself. That's starting to look a bit funky. Have I got that the right way? I'm dividing here. I want to multiply because we've got that white layer. That is looking good. The shadow is also looking good. Now let's plug in our alpha layer here, and that has brought back in our background but has made the rest disappear. Have I got that the right way around? I have got that the right way around. Let's just re-render to make sure that everything's working. Aha, there we go. The shadow's just by itself. If in doubt, re-render, and then if it doesn't work, then you can be in doubt or something along those lines. Okay, finally then we need to bring back in just the planes themselves. So we're going to be mixing the planes with whatever's coming out of here. So let's duplicate this multiply node, and we can use that as a starting point and plug in our planes. Now we're just mixing together because we want the planes by themselves on top of our scene with a factor of 100 where they are. So we need another ID mask, and using an ID mask of 1 here, so we've isolated that. We're saying anything that's the planes is 100%. Okay, we've got that just the wrong way around. Perfect. Excellent stuff. So let's just try that in another place in the scene. Now, if we move, is that auto-updating? Well, kind of. It's moved the scene, but it hasn't actually moved forward our models. So this is what they look like if they were just scooting around. We do need to re-render, but that's okay because during a render, there we go, the plane's just taking off. And let's go back a little further. Excellent. So we've got the planes flying very low level over the ground. Hopefully they don't look like they're about to hit the ground. That's crazy low level. Might need to adjust that in the final render. But now is the first pass of my final animation. Now, because it's my first pass, I'm not too fussed about the quality. I'm going to output this to my downloads folder, and then I'm going to set this to an H.264 encoding as an MPEG-4. The rest looks okay, and I'm going to call this planes first run. Now, it is important that I know what it is. I'm going to make sure that these settings are as low as possible. I don't care about quality at this point, and I'm going to leave it set at 5 samples, and I'm going to render out this animation. So render animation, and as we can see here, it's going to take several minutes to go through and render out all the individual frames and put them all together into our final composite. And I will see you guys back once this is rendered out. And here we go. So the plane's taking off and the others fly past. That looks great, apart from a little judder right at the very beginning as that plane's taking off. You see there, it scoots a little on the runway. I think we can modify that, and we're ready for a full render. Okay, so here isn't a full render. I haven't gone as deep as that, but what we have got here is a higher resolution so we can see more of what's happening on the screen. There's still a little bit of a judder on the runway, something we can always, well, we always come across things that we can refine about your models, but I'm really happy with that. How did you guys get on? I'd love to see your VFX and CGI. Please share your work in the discussions, and I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to Transparent Backgrounds. In this bonus video, we're going to learn how to set up your background as transparent. The options are different in both Blender Render and Cycles, so we'll cover both of those. And they're relatively straightforward, however the options are hidden away. And what you'll end up with, as you can see here, you will end up being able to present a model onto a background because the background itself is transparent. And let's go explore this now and hop on over into Blender. Okay, so we're over in Blender here, and let's just go ahead and render our scene. I'm going to hit F12 to do that. Now we can see on the info header bar, and obviously by this rendering itself being so starkly contrasted, it is Blender render. And you can see the background here is still grey. When it's transparent, you get that kind of checkered effect. Now, if we export this, as is in going to File and Save an Image, then we're going to end up with this cube with a grey background on it, which is not what we want. We want the cube isolated from the rest of the scene. So how do you do that? Well, it's in the render properties for both Blender Render and Cycles, but it's in different places. Logical, yes? Okay. So we need to scroll down until you find shading. It's probably collapsed as mine is here. If we go ahead and open that up, we have a series of options, and we need to change the option that says alpha, change that from sky to transparent. Now when we go ahead and render our image, you can see that the background itself has this checkered appearance. And then you can go ahead and go to Image and Save an Image. Now, I've already saved one here as a test, the one you saw a moment ago. I'm going to set one up that's for Blender Render, and I'm going to save that in a few moments. But before we do, let's go down to the lower left-hand corner and have a look at the options. So we've got a PNG selected at the moment, which does contain an alpha layer. However, sometimes a production of a PNG with an alphaed out layer, especially if there's a gradient between it being, the cube for instance is just a solid edge, so that's fine. If you have a graduated, something like a light effect or a particle effect, then you may want to select something different. You may wish to select TIFF. Now it's going to produce a larger file, but it's going to handle the alpha layer much better than potentially the PNG does. But store as a PNG first, see how it works out. And if you end up with a slight halo effect around your image when you apply it to a background, then you'll probably want to try out a different format. Color depth, well, most people don't have the ability to see more than 8 bits on their monitors, so you can leave it as that. However, if your model's being made for a high dynamic range environment, HDR TVs are starting to come around and monitors won't be far behind, I'm sure, you'll want to make sure that's set to 16 bits. In some ways, you know, it is better to have the highest quality possible, but on the same fronts, you don't need extra where it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. So with that selected, I can go ahead and click Save as Image, and now I've got an image on my computer with an alphaed out background that I can now apply to whatever I want. So we've explored that in Blender Render. How do we do it in Cycles? Well, we can switch over to the Cycles render engine first so we can see what's going on. The rendering properties change quite dramatically when this happens. And in order to render the background transparent, we need to change a couple of options. So let's first of all render it as it is and see what happens. Now, I'm currently using my CPU to render, and that's taking a little while to do. But I'm going to switch across to GPU now. I'm also going to change my samples. No, not samples. I'm going to change under my performance setting. This I'm going to set to 256 for the moment, just so it renders a bit quicker for you guys. So where in this muddle of options do we change to make this background transparent? Well, it's under the film drop down. This may or may not be open for you, so find the film properties and put a tick in transparent. And then we can see that if we hover over that, the world background is transparent. Now when we go ahead with that box checked and we hit render, we get it rendered out with the alpha layer. And once again, you can go ahead and save that to your hard drive. There we go, nice and straightforward, but it is a little bit complicated where they've hidden it away. I hope you find that incredibly helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to Solving Camera Motion. So this is going to be all about setting up camera movement and indeed working out whether the tracking we've just done is any good for our scene. You'll need the right camera details. I don't know if I've mentioned that before. I think I have. It is important. Whether you've got the camera details by faffing around for hours to try and get them, or indeed you know the camera details because you've got the spec, it is important to have the right camera details. So we'll go ahead and make sure that's one of the first things we get sorted. We're going to check the accuracy of our markers as we go through as well. Now, I was quite thorough, but I might have missed one as I was going through, because it may have looked on a sort of zoomed out scale like it wasn't jerking about too much. But we will go through and check the accuracy of our markers and dump any that are causing us problems. Now, an average camera solve error of less than 1 is ideal, but that's not always necessary. We may have a camera solve error of 6 and it work out to be absolutely fine. We do have to test and assess as we go through. You may have to refine your markers more. It may be that one of your markers is causing a big problem, so you have to get rid of it. There's lots of options and alleyways we can go down. But let's go ahead now and set up the camera movement over in Blender. Okay, so I've just reopened my file, and the first thing I've noticed is my lovely light blue line, where it was cached before, it's no longer cached. Now that's not surprising, because obviously if you shut down Blender, it's going to lose anything that's temporarily stored. So I'm going to go up to the top on my tool shelf, and instead of just playing the clip as we've done before, I can go ahead and prefetch, and the shortcut there is P. It will prefetch the frames from the disk for faster playback and tracking. And we can see that is a lot quicker than it was just hitting play. And now we should be able to scrub through. We can see it's consuming around 7.2 gigs this time round. I can hit reload. Now reload is a bit pointless in certain cases. It's only if you've edited the file on the disk itself on your computer, and now I'm going to have to prefetch again. Anyway, so we've got that now in our buffer and ready to go, and we can just go ahead and go to the next tab down on the tool shelf, which is the solve tab. Now before we do anything else, let's just click solve camera motion and see what happens. Wow, okay, I was not expecting that. After all the trials and tribulations I've been through trying to actually work out this scene, I've got a solve error, and we can see on the header bar for the clip editor, of 3.6, which is a great start. It turns out I may need to do nothing more, but we'll go through and refine it anyway. Oh, and before we do anything else, you know what I haven't done? And I said it was the first thing we're going to do. I got distracted by this blue bar. We need to go over to the properties and go to camera and set it to full frame, and scroll down to lens and set it to 20. Because that is what the DJI Phantom 4's lens configuration is said to be. Let's go ahead and click solve camera motion, and it goes up to 6.5. Okay, we can work with that. It's not great that it's gone up, but we can play with the settings now and work out what we can do. Now, one of the things we can do now we've got a solve error is we can have a look at individual tracking points, and they will all have an average error attributed to them. So if you've got something that's got a high average error, you may find, and I do say may find because it does vary, removing it from the scene can improve your particular odds of getting a good solve. So after clicking through all of those, I can see that that one's 7.6. Now before I do anything else, I'm going to save my work. Excellent. And I'm just going to delete this bush entirely. So we've got an average solve error of 3.6. Now before we do anything else, I do want to just highlight occasionally when you hit solve camera motion again, you get a different result. So let's go ahead and remove this one that's rated of an average error of 7.6 on the properties panel here. We can see if that, by removing it, we get a better result. So 3.6, solve camera, 2.92. That's much better. Now, I'm going to guess here, if I go through and remove the one that's 5.6, is there anything else that's above 4? That's going to be my metric here. And of course, I need 8 of these. Oh, wow, that's really low. So let's see, is there anything here that's above 4? I think there was. There's one that's 5, so let's get rid of that. Now, again, getting rid of it may not have been the answer. It may have been better to refine it, but let's solve now. We're on 2.9, 1.8. This is getting better and better. Now, incidentally, you can look at this graph editor, and it gives us an idea of the actual what's going on in terms of these markers and if they're jerking about too much. And if they are jerking about, that may cause us problems. Now, I'm really happy that we're down to 1.8. So I'm not going to do anything else for the moment because I need to check and see what that looks like being lean about it. So I'm going to scroll down on the tool shelf to Scene Setup. And I'll click Set as Background, which is going to set this particular video as the background on the camera view. And I'm going to set up a tracking scene as well. I'm now going to go over to the default layout, and from this view I'm going to watch the camera and make sure it's not doing anything crazy. If it starts doing crazy things and wobbling about, that can cause us issues. Now there's a few jerks at the beginning and a few around, let's just watch here, around 180 or so. Let's look at it from the camera, and now this will slow down tremendously. Now the important thing to note here is I'm going to have to hold down Shift to move, but I want to have a close eye at the cube itself or the ground. What I want to make sure is as this is playing through the timeline that it's not jerking about horribly and that it's consistent. So if the cube's covering up part of our scene, that it remains covering up part of that scene and not sliding and jerking all over the place. If it does slide and jerk all over the place, it just may look horrible in the end. Now, because I'm going for an aircraft flying over the surface, I can probably get away with a bit more jerk than I would do normally. Now I'm going to pause it there and go back to the beginning. Now it is sluggish doing this, but I do want to just highlight this beginning bit. If we have a look at the scene now, it jerks all over the place. You see that twitching? It was only for a couple of frames, but it's still very noticeable. Now there's something I can do here that's really easy. I get my starting frame and I set it at 10. I'm not quite sure actually where that wobble occurred, but I'm pretty sure it was below 10, the 10th frame. So that's one way of dealing with that. Just cut it off. It was a problem right at the beginning. Who cares if no one sees the first half a second? However, if you do need to make sure that that works, we need to investigate why it wobbles. And it will wobble like it does there. We can see that it's shifting from one place to another. And we can see the whole scene is shifting because of some reason. I can't tell you from here. I need to go back into the motion tracking view. And let's have a look at the graph editor at this point and see if we can glean any information as to what is going on here. So one of these I can see is jerking and moving in the preview pane here. In fact, the one we've got selected. So all of a sudden it jerks from one place to another. So we can literally go in and fix that for this one particular frame that it's wrong on and place it. I'm not sure where each frame was either side, and that's always a good place to check. Okay, so that has fixed that one. Could it been that just that one that was jerking all over the place? No, that also has a big shift to it. I don't know what was going on at the beginning. So I'm just going to move that over here. So it's literally frame 1, frame 2, frame 3 is fine. So let's go to the next one. And I may have to repeat this several times in order to refine it. Does this also jump? It does. How bizarre that each one happens. Now, because it's every time and rather consistent, annoyingly consistent, I can pretty much go through and fix all of these because it looks like they just need to be moved over ever so slightly. Does this one, whatever it does it do the same? Does it suddenly jerk? Yes, it does. So there's something in the footage there that's causing it to jerk about, and I don't like. And I'm just going to go away and fix this little issue, and I'll see you guys back in a few moments. In fact, it looks like here that the issue stems from the camera not moving for one particular frame, or perhaps a problem with the video. It could be something along those lines. But it looks like all of these frames are just shifted over by a tiny amount. it looks like just placing the marker on top of the previous one is working absolutely fine, which seems a bit of a cop-out really. I would have thought there was a fundamental reason why it was doing that, but it seems to have affected everyone. Perhaps it is a skip in the video, but it doesn't take too long to go through and just move everyone over everyone else. So I think that's now sorted. Now I've done that, I'm going to have to go through and solve the camera motion again. We're down to 1.82. Now, there's a couple of other things we can do to make sure things are a bit more steady. Now, we've got a keyframe A and a keyframe B, and this is where your 8 frames have to exist. If I set keyframe A to 0 and press solve camera motion, you'll get the error. At least 8 common tracks need to be there for reconstruction. What do you pick in order to... What keyframes do you pick? Well, usually you would pick the cleanest area of your footage. So from 1 to 30 is only that much. Is that enough? Well, we could pick from 10 to, where does this stop moving? Around 70. Let's do 10 to 70 and see if we get a better solve error because of that. 2.6. So the answer there is no by picking that one, but maybe 70 to 150. This is one of these ones where you can go through and you can check, see if we get a better result. 1.82. How about the whole lot from frame 1 to frame 230? Solve camera motion. 3.32. So there are various ones that are good. There are various ones that are worse. 1 to 20 gives us 2.6. 1 to 40 gives us 1.82. Back to that 1.82. That looks like a pretty good setting. And then once more, hop back to default. And again, if you've got a 3D view open, you can hop back to it. Let's whiz around to the camera view and see. Let's see what happens now over those first few frames. It's no longer jerking about. So now we have a 3D scene set up, being tracked. That means we can start placing things in this scene and giving them things like shadows. Oh, there was a little jerk there. This is why this playback is very important. Is that going to make a difference in the playback? Possibly. So I'm not sure where that was, but I'm going to go and play it back and have another look. And of course, it's time for you guys to have a challenge. I'd like you to go ahead and get a good camera solve. So aim for a low error rate. Now I have been rather fortunate in this particular scene that I've managed to get it so low so quickly. That doesn't always happen, and you often do have to refine, and that just comes with practice and getting used to how the markers act, what bounds you set them in, and sometimes it's just the luck of the footage. Some footage is a lot harder to track than others. Remember to check the actual footage, speaking about it. You can actually see little wobbles as it's going through, and the preview pane in the properties panel helps with that. Is it stable enough? Now this refers specifically to the 3D editor. So when you're looking through the camera with the background turned on, are you seeing the cube or the ground plane that's placed there slide about on your scene, or do they look like they're part of the scene? If they look like they're part of the scene, that's probably stable enough. I've got a couple of those little jerks that I can go through and fix, and I would want to fix them for completeness. However, thinking about it at the same time, if I've just got a plane flying over the surface, a little jerk may not actually be apparent in the video. So it's worthwhile knowing. Refine your markers. Add new or even delete more markers if necessary. If you find that brings the solve error down, then go ahead and sort that out. Now check the track preview in the properties panel isn't wobbling about too much. That should look pretty static throughout the entire timeline playback. If it's not, then you know there's somewhere else you can focus your work. And it's certainly great just previewing each one of the markers you've got in that panel and making sure it's not jumping about. Now I think I've spotted another jump. I'm going to have a closer look at that, and I think it's similar to what happened before in the one we fixed. So go ahead, pause the video now and go get yourself a good camera solve. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's hop back on over into Blender. Okay, so let's go and see if we can refine this even further. I'm going to go straight back to the motion tracking side of things, and let's have a look and see what we can do. Now, I've obviously selected everything there. I don't want everything selected. That can be a dangerous thing to do. And I was playing about, and I managed to get an average solve error of 145 when I was playing about. So just a word of warning, it is quite easy to screw things up. I'm going to set my keyframes here back to 40 and solve camera motion. There we go, we're back down to a sensible level, back down to 5.6. Now, one of the things I did notice, and I was doing a bit of reading on camera sensors, I'm really into my photography, and I realised that camera sensors, when they're doing video, often don't use the full sensor width. They are smaller. They use part of the sensor. Now, that will have the effect of we could either lower the sensor width, making it smaller, or we can go ahead and change the focal length because they're interchangeable, sort of. So the smaller the sensor, the larger the apparent focal length. And we can see that these things are linked because as I move one, the other moves as well. So if it's going to work out to be slightly smaller, do we make the sensor smaller? Well, that would make sense. So let's make the sensor width 35mm and do solve camera motion. 5.6. Let's do 33, 5.6, 32, 5.6. It looks like we're locked at 5.6 there. Does it work if we move... wait a minute. When I was moving that, of course it will be locked in. I just told you guys that it moves about. It will move this other one. So it makes more sense to change the focal length. So with the focal length, it would go the other way. It would go up apparent size. So let's go to the 22. That's gone to 16. Let's go to 24. And that's gone to, 1.9. Now that's starting to look good. So 24, let's try 23, because these numbers do jump about. 0.79. Brilliant. I'm really happy that that's worked out. So I'm just going to press solve camera motion again. My eyes are not deceiving me. So it does look like, with the information we've got here, we can say that the focal length, when taking a 4K video on this particular device, works out to be roughly 23mm, give or take. I'm not going to take that as a given for the moment, but there we go. We've got that sorted. Let's see how this looks when we go back to our 3D view. Let's go back to default and play that through. Now we've got the camera solve, starting from frame 1. So there's still a little bit of a jerk at the beginning that I need to go back and sort. And there was another one. You need to be keen-eyed. There it is. And that's around frame 45, something like that. So I need to have a closer look at those. I'm going to go do that now and see you guys back in a few moments. Hey, so I'm busy going through these particular keyframes and taking a close look at them. As we're approaching, I'm going to jump through with the timeline here. We reach frame 48, 49, 50, it jumps, and then at some point it comes back again. Now, what we can see on the graph editor at the top is we can actually see this deviation, this jump here, the marker we've got selected, and we've got this green part here. That is what we're looking at. So as we come through, we can see that that is where all of a sudden it jerks and then jerks back again the other way as it corrects itself. Now in this particular case, it does look like I can just go back in time to where the error occurs and just retrack forward from that point. And that does appear to solve the issue. Of course, I still need to do that for all of the markers in our scene, but that's somewhat better than having to manually place them all. So again, this seems to go wrong. Frame 49. Does this also have a dip on the graph editor? Yes, it does. So again, I'm going to play that forward, and we can see it smooths out those great big dips. Now we've got another dip here, so if I go to frame 49, I'm just literally going to jump there at this point and just play forward from here. It also jumps there, so I'll play that forward, and that smoothed out the dip as well. So it looks like during the tracks, it has mucked up somewhere. It's as simple as that. Does this jerk about around there or not? Yes, something happens a bit around the same area, in fact. Now, it's not as pronounced because the movement isn't as pronounced. It's as simple as that. So if I play forward, that should have solved that, and it should have retracked. Yes, it has. And again, I have to go through the rest of these and sort that out. I'll be back in a few moments. And I'm back again, and I think I've fixed all of my little problems. I've toyed about with the focal length at 22.8 with all of these fixed, all of these markers fixed. I'm getting a solve error of 0.63, which is excellent. I can now go to my default view and just play back what I've got. I've also decided to just truncate the very beginning at frame 5, and as we go through, I can't see any sudden jerks, which is exactly what I'm looking for, because now I can go ahead and build up the 3D scene with the plane flying through it. Exciting stuff. How did you guys get on? I hope you've managed to place your cube and plane, your ground plane, in the scene so that it looks as if it's part of it. Obviously, it doesn't look like it at the moment because we've got nothing applied to these models. However, we're well on our way now to making this work. Share your work in the discussions, perhaps a little animated GIF of what's going on, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to Blender camera tracking footage. So getting the right footage is important, just like getting the right picture was important with our CGI in it. Getting the right footage for a moving scene is equally as important. And initially, I would recommend using a low resolution video. High resolution video will require more memory and will be more taxing on your system. Now, there is an argument to be said that higher resolution video will have more opportunities for high contrast areas in them. That's also important. But we'll get to that in a bit. I'll be showing you how to allocate some more memory to the sequencer or clip editor so that you can utilize more of your system's memory than Blender's default 1 GB. Areas of high contrast in your footage are essential for auto tracking. Sure, you can go ahead and place markers manually, but that's going to be no fun. We'll want to avoid that if possible. So what else about the footage? Shorter video is better. If you have a look at any production film or even a short CGI animation, you're going to see that the scenes themselves, they flick very quickly. They're only a few seconds long. I would probably say don't try to go for any longer than 10 seconds unless the scene really requires it. Now, if you've got several videos that you're joining together, remember, if they're part of the same scene, same time frame, consistent lighting does really help. So if you've shot one video at the beginning of the day, one at noon and one at the end of the day, and they're supposed to be at the same time, the lighting is going to look dramatically different. In the morning and the evening, shadows are a lot longer. So it's something to bear in mind, and that can ruin the illusion that you're trying to put together. Now, you will need the same camera and lens information that we did with the still image, and this can be problematic. The more you know about the scene, the better. So this is one of these instances where you better even know the camera person who took the video, and they know the details about the video, or it's one you've taken yourself. Otherwise, it can be very difficult because the video does not have the same metadata that a picture has. Very rarely have I ever seen the information for a video contain anything other than its resolution and maybe its frame rate as well as its size and all that lot. So that's going to leave us a bit in the dark if you don't have that information. Now, some tips when recording your own footage. Now, you may have seen in the movies that people and cars and buildings and other bits and bobs sometimes end up with stickers stuck on them called markers. Well, if the scene is green screened, which often happens in production, a character that is moving and is then to be replaced with a CGI character, or indeed there is a lack of high contrast, you can place markers in the scene. So if there's nothing distinguishable, and you can obviously control this if you're shooting the footage, if there's no high contrast areas, you may need markers in the scene itself in order to camera track properly. Now, are they going to be covered up by the CGI? If not, then you're going to have to remove them afterwards. So try and avoid actually putting markers where they're not going to be covered up. And finally, keep a log of your camera's setup. Remember that some cameras are different, so I've got an iPhone in front of me, don't just write down iPhone, write the version of the iPhone it is. Otherwise, you may get confused when you put in the details for an iPhone 5 and it's an iPhone 6 or it's an iPhone 7 or whatever. You know, these things can make a difference. So let's go import some footage now and hop on over into Blender. Right, so now that we're over in Blender, the first thing I'm going to do is switch myself across to the video editing windows. Now we're over here, we've got a breakout of everything. Now, this is going to seem quite cramped again because I'm running at a lower resolution. Feel free, by the way, if you've got multiple monitors, to start using your multiple monitors. It's a great idea in this instance. So we need to import something into Blender. And we can do that on the video sequence editor. And this particular view, we can switch between views with these 3 toggles that move quite violently. This is the sequencer view. The next one along is the image preview. And then after that, we have the sequencer and image preview. So the image preview is the one in the top right-hand corner. We're not actually going to use the curves in this particular lecture, so I'm going to make that disappear. So we've literally got one on top of the other, and there's a timeline underneath so we can play, rewind, etc. Let's go ahead now and add a movie into our scene. Now I'm going to pick the high resolution, so I'm going to go into my assets, drone footage. I'm going to go to the 4K footage because it's really going to show the problems that you can have when it comes to large files. So I'm going to add this movie strip in. Now, incidentally, it will add the movie wherever your timeline was positioned. So if it was at frame 135, it would have popped it in there. Fortunately, it was at frame 1. Now, if I go ahead and hit play, we can see in the video where we've actually got the clip itself, the image preview going, it's running at about 10 frames per second. Now we're up to about frame 130. I'm going to stop that and go back to the beginning and play. And we can see that it's now running at 30 frames per second and nice and smoothly. And then it drops back down again. So it's caching that information. It's starting to store that information. Now, if you're working on a larger project, you may find you run out of buffer to do that on. And it will depend, again, on your system's specifications. Now, this is all to do with the system memory, not your graphics card memory. So if you've got enough memory, what we can do is go to File, User Preferences, and go to the System tab. Once you're on the System tab, you may have to scroll down or expand this out. But on the this middle column here, Sequencer and Clip Editor at the bottom, there's a memory cache limit. And this is measured in megabytes. If we hover over it, like most things, it gives us a little tip. So it's the memory cache limit in megabytes. Now, you don't want to set this any higher than your system's value, that's for sure. And you don't want to set it at your system's value either. But because I'm going to be working with this 4K file, and I've had a bit of practice putting together these lectures, I know that this 4K file is not going to be able to, the entire thing is not going to be able to fit into 1 gigabyte. So there are a couple of things we can do. We can chop up the file to just the specific area we need, but we might not be able to do that. We may need more memory to work with. And again, this does depend on your system memory as well. My computer that I'm on at the moment has 16 gigabytes of RAM. So I'm going to give myself 8 gigabytes, using about half the capacity, if it needs to. It won't suddenly consume 8, it will just use up to 8 to cache video. Anything that's in the sequencer and clip editor. I'm going to save my user settings and close down user preferences. Now, if I left this to play out, it would go through and it would remember the whole thing. Incidentally, I can also scrub backwards and forwards nice and quickly. If I go outside the range that I've already gone to, it starts jerking about, which is less than ideal. So nice and smooth here, all jerky if we go further on. And this is a 30-second clip. So if I let that play out, it would take roughly 3 times longer. It would take about 1.5 minutes to play through, and then the entire thing will be cached. And you can see how much memory you're currently using. If I just set this playing now, it'll whiz through at 30 frames per second. On the info header bar at the very top here, we've got the version of Blender, etc, etc, and then we have the memory utilization, and we can see that if I just leave the mouse over there, it does nothing, but if I keep revisiting it, it will update. So we've currently got 590 megabytes, and it's not going up anymore. Well, it's not going up because our start and end frame, we've got a start frame at 1 and an end frame at 250. If we look at the timeline, sorry, not the timeline, the sequencer just here, where we have the name of the file and its location on the hard drive, and then at the very end, there's a vertical slash, I'm not quite sure what those are called, but then we've got 908. So this is 908 frames long. So if I update that to 908 frames and leave it to play, it will actually buffer all the rest, and we can see the frames per second in the top left has dropped down. And I'm going to use my mouse wheel here just to move that back along so we can see the rest of the info header bar. And this, as you can see, if I you've got to use your mouse wheel in the right place, is now at 800, 900, so that's climbing up. That's using the memory on the computer. Now, when it comes to editing this file itself, being able to scrub through, just left-clicking here and going backwards and forwards, is quite useful and very powerful because it allows us to see our scene really easily. But we can also chop up our scene. So we can place the playhead at any particular point. We could do that manually down at the bottom here. We've still got the counter going up at the moment, so we can position it exactly using this, or we can just do a rough cut by clicking and dragging. And I'll do that in a few moments after this is finished counting up. Excellent, so that's now all done, and we can see it's using nearly 2 gigabytes worth of memory. And that's a lot if you think about it's just a short clip. Now, this is one of the reasons why I'd recommend perhaps not working with 4K footage, but maybe 720p. Also, the 720 footage is there for you guys that don't have really quick broadbands. It's as simple as that. You can get going much quicker. Okay, so now we've got this buffered and we can scrub between it. We can start to pick where to make cuts. And there are a couple of types of cuts that we can make. So if I positioned the cursor just, let's say, here, where the airfield starts to come into view in the lower corner there, I can go to the strip and we've got a load of options. And at this particular point, I'm talking about cutting. And there are 2 types of cutting, cut soft and cut hard. The main difference between cut soft and cut hard is the cut soft allows you to stretch and adjust the timing of the clip. Cut hard does not. So once I've cut hard at this particular point, it may take a few seconds to do. I can't extend this backwards and forwards. I can move these clips about using the right mouse button. In fact, most of the controls you'll come across are very similar. I can press X to delete if I wanted to. But because I've done a soft cut there's no way of extending this back again and recovering the early footage. If I'd done a soft cut, I would be able to. So I can use that to cut up parts of my image, and I can hopefully undo those changes. There we go, we're back again. Now, can I undo a cut that's been made? So we're in the right place, and again, something that I'm not used to doing is waiting, because the computer's relatively quick, my computer, when doing most things. However, waiting for things to happen with the video editor can be time consuming as you're sat there. Now, as you see, I've faffed about with that and it's jerky again. Now, if I keep moving the cursor backwards and forwards, eventually it will start storing those frames. In fact, as I'm doing this, if you take a cursory glance up at the memory at the top, it's storing each of these frames as it jumps over it, and eventually it will start to get smooth again. So when you're doing editing like that, it can clear some of your buffer if you're not careful. So just bear that in mind. So now we can get a movie clip onto our sequencer and we can cut it up. I think it's time for a challenge. Okay, so a quick challenge for you guys. I'd like you to go ahead and import your footage. So cut down your chosen footage to a suitable length. I don't recommend leaving it minutes long, perhaps 10 seconds or less. set up your camera accordingly. So we haven't done that just yet, and if you're following along with my particular videos, then the supplied footage was shot on a DJI Phantom 4 drone. So you'll have to go and have a look and find the camera settings for that particular model. As always, remember to save your work, that is quite important. But when saving your work, remember that your footage is not stored in the blend file itself. So I'd recommend putting it in its appropriate place now, and then don't move it, rename it from its location on your computer. Very important. Otherwise, you'll open up your file again and it will just be blank, which would be no good. So pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. So now I've got my footage in, I just need to cut it to a suitable length and set up the camera settings. So let's go ahead and hop back on over into Blender. So I've got two things to do here. I need to pick the right length and I also need to set up the camera. I'm going to do the length first. So I really want it coming in around where the airport, where we can see the runway over there, and that looks to be around here, around the 5-second mark. I'm going to use the shortcut key Shift and K for that hard cut. There we go, and I'm going to get rid of this beginning footage, erase, and then the footage here we can see on in the properties panel over here, the start frame. I'm just going to set that back at 1. It stops me having to drag things about. Because that can be a bit, well, I'll show you here. If I start dragging about, it's really jerky, simply because it's not buffered all of that stuff yet. I don't want to deal with that, so that's that done. Now I want about 8 seconds or so, so that'll be all the way up to where it says 8, which is very useful, and it looks like, yes, that's pretty good. It looks like the airport itself, or the runway there, disappears about that point as well. So it appears and disappears there. So I'm going to set that at 8, and again do another hard cut with the footage selected here, and I'm going to get rid of that extra bit. So I've got my 8 seconds of footage here, and how many frames is that? That's going to be, oh, is it 8 times 24 or 25? I can't remember what I've got it set up to be. Either way, I'll find out in a moment when it gets to the end of it. 240, something like that. All very close. Very, very close. I'll leave it at 240 for the moment, and once that's buffered, which it now is, perfect, and it will play back, we can see that the airstrip here is in view, and then it comes out again. Perfect. That's a good time, and in fact here we can see it cuts out, and then there's an extra frame. So it looks like it's 239. Okay, so now that we've got all of this lot in place, we need to sort out the camera details. Now, this is where it starts to get a bit interesting. Looking at the specifications for the DJI Phantom 4, I literally went to Google, and I'm typing that on another screen if you're wondering what's going on, and we have the details here. We've got a camera sensor size on there. There's 19 more. Or let's go to the official DJI website. And if we scroll down here, we have the sensor size, and we've got the field of view. And here it says it's a 20mm 35 format equivalent. Now, 35mm format equivalent means full frame camera. So we can use that to our advantage of not having to worry too much about this extra information. And I will go and show you that right away. Because if we go ahead, let's make sure I save my file. Movie, that's fine. And let's go ahead and go new. So we have a sensor. Let's go to our camera properties and look through that camera. This is a certain camera setup, and I don't know what it is at the moment, so I'm going to go to the camera properties and go full frame camera, that's fine, and focal length of 20. So that's what a 20mm equivalent will look like when it's looking at that cube. Now, if we go ahead and add another camera into our scene, so I've just duplicated that and gone, and let's call it Phantom, so we just know what's going on. We've got the cube there, we've got the Phantom camera. Now the Phantom camera, according to their spiel, is 2 1/3 across. 2.3 inches. So we can go to our sensor size here and go 2.3 times 2.54, and that should convert inches into millimeters. And there we go. We've got 5.48 millimeters. That sounds about right for a tiny camera. And then we can adjust the focal length accordingly so it roughly matches. I mean, if you needed to be really, really precise, you could actually go ahead and do it with mathematics to get you to the right point. However, there is another thing that needs to be taken into account, which is quite tricky. Each sensor can record video not across the whole sensor. It could record it only on part of the sensor, effectively changing the sensor size when it comes to actually recording. And that will completely change the actual angle of the camera, etc. Now, because DJI provided us with the 35mm equivalent, I'm literally going to stick to that. It's a full frame camera, and I've adjusted these settings now, which is a bit silly. That was 32 before and 20. So I'm going to have my camera set up with a focal length of 20 at full frame camera, full frame 35mm camera. So I'm going to go ahead now. I've demonstrated that. Back to this, which is the file I'm working on. Go back to the default view, go to our camera, and I'm going to make sure the camera is named appropriately. So I'm going to call it DJI camera, and I'm going to call it 20mm 35, and equiv should be enough. So I know what's going on there. So I can go to my camera settings, and it's currently set at 35. If we set that to 20, there we go. That should now have the right field of view for whatever scene we set up. Now, our footage is quite distant footage, so we're going to have to, the camera itself is going to be positioned quite a way back from this ground plane, etc. So there's a good chance we'll have to play with some clipping distances again, but we'll deal with that in a bit. So we've got the clipping here. In fact, whilst we're here, it'd be silly not to set that to a bit higher. I'm going to set it to 1,000 meters or a kilometer. Again, with the height of where that drone was, that might not be enough. We'll leave it at 1,000 for the moment and tinker with it if necessary. So now we've got all that sorted, we can save our file and we're ready to go. Brilliant! How did you guys get on? Are you using the footage that I'm using, or are you using your own footage? I'd love to see your work. Remember to share on the forums, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to Blender Camera Tracking Markers. So we're going to be talking about tracking markers. What are they? Well, markers track parts of the footage, and they can automatically do that as the footage progresses. But we do need to make sure they're in an appropriate place and they have the right settings applied to them. You will see that markers use similar controls to the 3D editor, so we can literally use the G key to grab them and move them about if we wanted to. Now, you will need a minimum of 8 in the scene to effectively track a camera. Obviously, the more you have, the better. We'll have a look at pattern size and search size. These are 2 parameters that a tracker can have, discovering what they can do. And I would recommend placing markers manually. There's a nice button that says, do it for me. And to be quite honest, it doesn't work. Or doesn't work very well in most scenes. Or not at all. So just do it manually. Save yourself the headache. Let's go play with markers now and hop on over into Blender. Okay, so there are a couple of things that we have to go over just before we start adding markers to our scene. First of all, we can change our layout here and move it across to the motion tracking layout. Now, when we switch it across to that, we get a series of viewports, some of which look familiar, some of which are new to us. And we've got 3 new ones, which are all the same. The movie clip editor. Now, in order to make this sane for me, I'm just going to tidy this up. Otherwise, I will go a bit mad. And I certainly don't need them all open to demonstrate what's going on. The first thing I need to do once I've got a sane layout, and indeed if you guys have more than one monitor, do take advantage of the fact you can spread your work out. It'll save you a lot of time. First things we need to do is actually bring in the footage that we've already got. And unfortunately, there's no link between the video sequence editor and the movie clip editor. Annoying, yes, unfortunately. So what you're going to have to do, and if you haven't done it yet, that's fine. You need to export the video you've just made within Blender. You need to export that out as an MP4 or something like that so you can bring it back in and open it up here. If you have any other editing software, you can use that as well. So don't feel you need to use Blender if you've got another bit of software. For instance, on a Mac, QuickTime works really well. You can trim your videos very, very quickly. And for those following exactly along, we'll need to have to go and open using the open on the movie clip editor. And let's go to VFX drone footage 4K cut. That will be available for you in the section assets as well. And I've got my 8 seconds of airfield. Excellent. So now that's loaded up, there's a few extra bits to show around the screen. So we've got a tool shelf on the left, a properties panel on the right, and we'll be hopping between those with the markers. And we've also got this blue bar along the bottom. This blue bar is the caching that we've already set. If you remember, we've got in the system preferences, in the user preferences under system, make more sense, we changed the sequencer and clip editor, and I set mine to 8 GB because that's what I felt comfortable devoting to this process. We're working with a 4K bit of footage here, so this might eat up quite a bit of memory. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and hit play on the timeline, and nothing happens. But when we stop playing back, we stopped it at frame 50, it suddenly jumps to that frame. Little bit annoying that does not control what we're seeing up here. However, what we can do is, whilst the cursor is hovered over the video clip, we can actually go Alt and A and just start it playing. Now this is going to be at a much lower frame rate whilst it's caching. And on the info header right at the very top, if I just scroll this header along, you might not have to do that. Oh my word! We are at 4.5 gigs already. Let's let this go through the entire thing. And we notice here on the movie clip editor, that blue bar along the bottom is becoming a different color blue. And now it's entirely cached. And how much memory are we using? 7.5 GB. Wow. Okay, that's a lot. So just bear in mind when you're working with high resolution footage, you can actually end up filling your RAM very quickly. So we've cached the actual clip itself. We're ready to go with adding markers. The first thing I would do before even thinking about placing a marker on here is just to scrub backwards and forwards through the footage, which now we can do because it's cached. It'll be nice and smooth by just clicking on the timeline and dragging across, or indeed the graph editor, which is part of the movie clip editor at the top as well. We can do it in 2 places that we've currently got open. Now, I'm actually going to get rid of my properties panel as well to give me even more space. On the left-hand side on the tool shelf, there's a section for marker, and we can add the marker. We simply click the add button and then place it where we want on the screen. And that is very, very small. So what I would advise before placing a marker like the one I've just placed here, and I'm just using the middle mouse button to zoom in and to scroll, as in scroll wheel up and down, and if I press and hold the middle mouse button, I can pan around the scene as well. So I've zoomed in to my marker. Now, ideally we want to place a marker in a high contrast area, like where it's white here. Now I can move this marker that we've just placed with the G key. And when I move it around, I can just move it like anything else we've moved before. Now over on the properties panel, if the track's not open up the track, and you can do fine adjustments over there as well. And when we start tracking our footage, this is a good place to look to see how it's moving. So we've got a marker placed, and we've got some settings over here under tracking settings. I tend to leave these types of tracking settings as default for the moment. Now, the pattern size is the area that Blender is analyzing from frame to frame. And if that's too large, it just slows Blender down significantly. So it is important to kind of have a balance between pattern, size, and speed of which you want to do the recognition. Search size is how far Blender will look from the original pattern to find the pattern again. Now, if you've got footage that pans or moves quickly, you may have to have a large search size. Now, I don't tend to set mine over here so aggressively. I tend to change it over in the properties panel, and it will vary from footage to footage as to what you need to do. Now, I will expand the tool shelf here, and we'll just carry on to the motion model. That can be incredibly important and will dictate how well Blender manages to track a scene. At the moment, it's just set to location. We've also got location and rotation, location and scale, location, rotation and scale, a fin or a fine, and perspective. These are all different ways of Blender interpreting the transformation of anything that we're tracking. I'm going to leave it set to location at the moment, and then I'll look at the image on the right, and as it's starting to track it, I'll work out, well, is it rotating? Is it zooming in or zooming it out? Things closer to this camera are going to be changing more rapidly than something further away. In fact, something further away, its location just might change rather than its apparent size. And matching, keyframe matching, or whether you pick the previous frame. Now, keyframes, we've not assigned any keyframes. This is where we would place this marker at certain points, and then it would link between those keyframes, or previous frame just looks at where it was before. In general, I've found previous frame a great starting point because it just looks at what happened before. Because we've placed a marker here, and it's the selected marker, it is highlighted. Now, if we hold down Control, we can also add additional markers, and you can see that only one of them at a time is highlighted, but we can select them all with the A key. Now, when we've got them all selected, and I've just dotted these round at random, we can scroll down a little further and start a track. Let's start a track now and see what happens. Okay, what happened there? It seemed to stop very quickly. Well, looking at what's happened, we started this on frame 208 and it just went to the end. We played forward from frame 208 and it successfully got, as I said, all the way to the end. We can also play backwards. So if we go to frame 208 and press track selected markers this time backwards, or we can use, as you can see there, the shortcut Shift, Control and T. And it's managed to track quite a way. I'm actually surprised, but we seem to have lost two of the trackers at some point. Now, I can tell that we've lost two of the trackers because I can only see two of them that are highlighted. Oh no, we've lost three because there were 5 of them in total, but these ones seem to have held on the entire time. If we select individual ones, we can see at this point in time, i.e. frame 1, these two have tracking points and these ones are lost. They literally turn pink when they're lost, and we can see in the preview they're also pink. Now I'm going to select those 3 that we've got there because they were just random. I'm going to hit the X key to delete them. You could also delete any selected ones over in the tool shelf as well. Now if we go ahead and let's have a closer look at this one here, and as we're tracking, it seems like that has done a wonderful job in tracking. If we take a look at the preview box on the properties panel, we can see that that's working really, really well. Incidentally, when you're zoomed in on a scene and you want to visually see this, it can disappear, and that can be really annoying. So what we can do is on the properties panel, if we scroll down and have a look at, here we go, under display, lock to selection. That means as we move this backwards and forwards, the actual footage itself moves around rather than our marker, which can be very handy when trying to see if it's jumping all over the place. Now that one there, I'm really surprised with that it's managed to actually work in that way. Now notably here, blue is going forward and red is looking backwards. So depending on where you're going, we can step through with the timeline to each individual one, and the next frame that's being tracked is the next blue marker. Okay, so we've got 2 in there, and they've actually worked out relatively well. I'm really surprised that that small area there worked as well as it had. But what we haven't done is customized any of the search selection, which can be really handy. So let's focus in on this bush down here. I'm going to use Control and click to focus on it. Now, I can't see the search area. It's not visualized unless I go to Marker Display on the Properties panel and put a tick in the search box. And this is the area of which is going to be searched. We can change these area types. Not only are they square at the moment, but we can make them rectangular or even change the shape completely. I'm going to go to marker, and the marker is enabled. It's got a position on the screen itself, and here we have the pattern width and height, and we have the search area width and height. Now this footage pans to the left and right a lot, so increasing the width of a search area is a great start. Now again, I'm on frame 30 here. Now here's a great time-saving tip for you. I would recommend only placing 1 marker at a time and then working through your footage. It's very easy to just put several markers down, hit play, and then it can get quite messy to try and figure out what was going on. Also, when you put down more than 1 marker, there's a good chance that you'll move the timeline and look, the marker's no longer over that bush. So the marker doesn't move until it's started to track. Now, because I'm at frame 30, that may cause me a slight issue. I'm going to use the scale key, the S key, just to scale up so that the whole bush is in that pattern area, and I'm going to move with the G key it about, or indeed I can grab it over here and move it about as well on the properties panel. So I'm happy with that there, and initially I'm going to play back, so I'm going to go to track and play back, and I'm hoping when we play forward it'll either reach the end or fail, and it reached the end perfectly, and we can see to reflect that we've got a yellow line along the bottom. Now occasionally you will do something and it will lose track, and I'm trying to find something that's losing track. This is going surprisingly well. Let's place one here and just play that backwards in this case. Excellent, it's lost track. Now if this happens, you may have to zoom in, hit the G key and replace, and try again and go backwards from there. Now what's happening here is because the camera's moving quite rapidly, the search area is not large enough. So I'm going to move that once more, but this time on the properties panel, go down and increase the width of the search area and then play. And there we go. It's tracking much, much better. In fact, it managed to do the entire rest of the clip. So that is a great way of testing whether the search is going to make a difference. Now you do have to be careful when you've got lots of things that look very similar. If you set the search bound too large, it will hop about something crazy trying to track all of these little objects here. In a past test, I was trying to track these white objects, and they would try and bounce between them if I wasn't careful with my placement. So that looks really good. I'm happy with these few tracks we've got so far, and it's time for a challenge. I'd like you to go ahead and add more markers. So add more markers into your footage. Track them through your footage as well. So you should see those red and blue lines backwards and forwards. And try and make sure they track throughout the entire however many frames you've got. I would aim for at least 10 to be in the scene at all times. And just a hint here, it's better to have a fewer accurate markers than many inaccurate ones. And we can go and refine those later on, depending on how much refining they need done to them. So go ahead now, pause the video and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go ahead and add some more markers to our footage. Right, so I'm going to zoom out for a moment, and I'm not going to bore you with adding loads of markers to the footage, but what I want to get a grips on is this is the starting frame, and if I want to track something, it can't be off of this frame at the beginning, and it can't be off at the end as well as things move about. So that is important to remember as we're going backwards and forwards. Excellent. So that's a great start. Oh, that kink at the end, I don't like that. So I'm going to withdraw. I'm going to actually pull down the frame count to 230. So we're going to end there, and then we scoot back to here. Now, one of the things with tracking that marker there does is it does kind of skew the video just a little, and I don't like that for the moment. So I'm going to turn off lock to selection, and then it's not bending the video too much. It's just going to help with tracking quite significantly. So there's parts of this that are in the frame all the time, and there is parts that are not. Now I'm going to pick probably a couple of bushes in the foreground. How long does this one stay in? So let's zoom in to where I'm talking about, because there are lots of bushes. So we've got one here, we've got one on the corner there, a dark one here that we can track. Ideally, we want it spread off from the foreground all the way into the background as well. And in the background, because we're working with 4K, or I can pick out things in the field like this bush here, or whatever that lump is, and some other places in the field that I can use as tracking markers. Unfortunately, I've not been able to place markers on this scene, and I don't think I would have been able to see them anyway if I did. So there's a dark patch here, there's shadows, all of these things can be used to track. And in fact, you could select the entire bush and track it, or there's a white mark on the field. So let's start adding markers and seeing where we get. So I've added this again at frame blooming 35. That's no good. So let's go to frame 1 and move it to an appropriate location. I'm going to use the properties panel here to help guide me. I'm going to zoom out ever so slightly. So we've got a larger tracking area. Now I need to decide where I'm going to place it on this marker, and I'm going to place it just there and then run forward and see if we've got enough. That seems to track it the entire way through, and I can scrub and see how well it's tracked it. And that's done I think that's done a pretty good job. I won't know, of course, until we come to solving it later on, but that's not in this challenge. Now, I'm not going to bore you with placing the other ones, but I will see you back in a few moments after I've placed a few more on my scene. Okay, I thought this would be a great time to jump back in. I've got one of these ones that's going to be a little problematic. Now, when you come across something problematic, it's worthwhile considering whether or not to keep it. So here, I'm tracking this point, and then all of a sudden it jumps to here. Now, what I can do here is just move it back to the right location, giving it a new point, and then rolling forward again, and seeing if it follows throughout the entire scene. Following. Perfect. Okay, just a couple more to do. As you can see, I'm going to select them all here so you can see various size search boxes, and this is coming on nicely. It's spread across the entire scene as well, and it does shift forward. So as we go forward, probably the last thing at the bottom here, we've got a corner of the field, and we've also, so we've got this corner here that's in the scene, that shadow, that dark patch that might be in there all the time. This particular tree here doesn't have a shadow on it at the beginning because of the way the camera is moving forward. So I'm going to see if I can track the entire bush. That may or not may be possible, but then I think I've got more than enough markers, perhaps one right at the very top of the map as well, or off the scene. See you back in a few moments. Okay, so this is my final setup. I'm just going to highlight all of my various markers that I've got, and as I play through, I'm going to just drag across the timeline here. I can see I've got a good patch here. I do seem to have a rogue one floating about. I thought it was tracking something. It, however, does not do any tracking at all. I wonder what it was linked to, if anything at all. That's this one in the top corner here. Okay, that's not doing anything. I'm just going to delete it and remove it from the scene. How are your markers looking? Did you use the same scene as me? If so, how did you select your markers? Where did you select them? Please remember to share your particular setup. Take a screenshot and share it in the discussions. And I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to good source material. Now, what do we mean by source material? Well, like reference material in the past, but this time it's actually going to be used within our final render. So this could be a picture, a photo, a video, or even another render that you've done. Now, in a bit, we'll grab a photo and check out its settings. Now, this is important for both stills and photos, and I'm going to hammer this point home because it really does save you a lot of time. With your own video, keep a note of the settings as they're often lost. So what device you took it on. In fact, let's get to the essential data that you're going to need. Now, this is a little bit of a white lie. You can get by without this information. However, it will take a lot of your time and toing and froing and trying to get the scene just right. If you've got the data, it can speed up things a lot. So the resolution of the recorded data, the camera sensor size, and the lens focal length. Now, some of these you're going to have to look up for certain devices, and some of them are built into Blender, so we can use a combination of research or just a preset that's straight away available to us. Now, pictures, fortunately, often have this data stored with them, and you can right-click on them, and on a Windows machine you can go to Properties, or on a Mac you can go to Get Info, and if the picture has this information stored with it, then you will actually be able to look at that and record it down, and then we can set up our camera in the scene with the same settings. Now, if it's a render that you've already done, you'll have to use the camera settings that were in that other blend file. Now, things that are nice to have is... Oh, before we move on to that, I do apologise. Pictures do have this data stored with them, but videos do not. So it is a great idea that you note down what device the video was recorded with, if that's possible. Now, nice to have, well, measurements of the area you're working in. That's very useful for working out distances and placing things at a certain scale within your scene. Position of any lighting. Now, if it's an outdoor scene in the daytime, there's usually one prominent light, that is the sun in the sky, that will be the source of most of your lighting. However, if it's an indoor scene, you may have several lights scattered about contributing to your scene. If you take a note of where those are and perhaps the intensity of them, or just say they're all the same, then at least you've got a good standing to start using that photo or video. Now, in this particular instance, we're going to use a photo, so the lighting is probably just going to be the sun. Keep things simple, remember that. Now, a couple of things to look out for. Light direction and looking for shadows. Now, they kind of go hand in hand, and shadows can be both a blessing and a curse. So you will want to make sure shadows don't cross over where your object will be. If they do, you're going to have to create another object to cast that the real shadow on top of your object, and of course delete the other one. And this entails more and more work, and we want to avoid getting too nitty-gritty at this point. Certainly there will be instances, if you ever go into this fully, where you will have to edit the actual picture or video and cut things out and mask things off, but we're not going to go quite that deeper dive in this section. Reflections are very similar to shadows. They can give away the true nature of a scene. And so we do have to be careful if there are reflections. Instances like that could be a glass building or a mirror. That's a good reflective surface. Cars tend to be reflective. They're going to reflect the area around them. Things that you might not focus on, like a puddle on the ground. Those can reflect and give away the fact that, hang on a minute, there should be a reflection of the object in there as well. Again, if we can avoid those type of things, we can get on really well and quickly. That's the important thing. Now, you will also have to watch out for anything in the foreground. Those foreground objects can cause you a bit of a nightmare. They're in front of your object, and therefore you've got to work around them. So at the moment, I would avoid foreground objects where possible. So finally, if you were creating your own source material, you can have a bit more control over how it's looking. So with photos, take measurements of the scene, that's very important, as well as the camera settings that you currently have. So remember what focal length you've switched your camera to. If it's a fixed length camera, you may have to research. So if you've taken a video or photo with your iPhone or Android device, then you'll want to look up the specs of the camera. With videos, you can lay down markers, especially if your CGI is going to cover the area in question, and that can help massively. High contrast is key, because that helps with camera tracking, and we'll see that later on. Now, you will want to avoid sharp and jerky movements. It makes tracking the camera really, really difficult and time-consuming. Now remember, and this is the last time I'm going to say this is so many times, to store your camera and lens settings. Make sure you know what they are. It's going to help you a lot. Okay, so now we've got the groundwork sorted for what source material is ideal to be working with, it's time for a challenge, and I'd like you guys to go find a photo. Now find yourself a suitable photo to work with. Think about your project, what you're working on, and what you are trying to achieve. Remember, please keep things simple, especially if this is your first time doing any visual effects. Now, I'll personally be finding a runway because I'm doing a CGI plane and I'm going to place that on the runway. Now, make sure your image has camera details. Now, if you've gone off and taken a photo, great, you're going to have all the details because you've actually taken the photo. But if you haven't and you're sourcing a photo from online, make sure that it does have those camera details embedded in it. Go ahead, pause the video, and go find a suitable photo. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go see what I found and make sure it's suitable. Okay, so after searching the web for a bit, I have found a picture I really like. We can see where the light source is. It's the sun and it's just dipping below the mountain top there, just glaring out. And that's going to give us some lovely warm colours as well. It's going to produce long shadows when it's so low on the horizon. And now I don't have to attribute this, but I will since I'm on the site. But before I go any further, of course, let's just make sure that this particular photo is suitable, because I don't know any of the settings. It might just be an image. Okay, so clicking download has just opened it up for me. So it's a nice high-res image. That's very useful. Look at that, lots of detail. Okay, so I'm going to right-click and save the image in my downloads for the moment and open it up. Now you can right-click on the download itself and go to properties, or indeed right-click and go to get info. I believe I can get info from preview on a Mac as well. So we can see straight away, I'm going to go to the File tab first of all. We've got of course, we've got the number of pixels it is. That's also easy to look up, so that's a great start. I'm going to look under the EXIF data. Now this should give us, here we go, focal length. So we've got that. We need to know what camera it was taken on. I'm guessing it's taken on a camera. Yeah, we've got the lens model here. Now that can be very useful if you're trying to exactly mimic a real life lens, because we could go and get the data for that lens if it's got any particular distortion. But do we have the camera type? So let's go along here. Here we go, a Canon EOS 1100D. I don't know the sensor size for that, so I'm going to search for Canon EOS 1100D. I'm just going to literally go sensor size. Now I'm a bit of a photographer. I'm going to assume it's their ASP, this one here, of that size. So its width here is going to be 22.2. So I've written down all of these bits of information, making sure that I can go back to them if I need to. It's quite an affordable camera. Excellent. I really like this photo. I'm looking forward to working with it. How did you guys get on? Are you going to use the photo that I've got here? Are you going to follow along with a plane? You could put a car on there if you wanted to as well. Cars and runways kind of go together. If you picked a different scene, I'd love to see what projects you're going to work on. Remember to share that in the discussions, and I will see you guys in the next lecture.
Hey guys, so welcome to this section on VFX. Lots to cover in here. We're going to start with a still image and actually put CGI into a real photo. And then as a bonus, we're going to get a video and put the CGI, a plane in this case, into that and whoosh, straight along. Be lots of fun. But what's this bonus section all about, Ben?
So why a bonus section? Again, because we started all of this with a Kickstarter, we made some promises and we plan on delivering on our promises. So you're getting this content for free. That's why it's called a bonus section. It's smaller than some of the others because we focus tightly on the fact you already know how to use Blender, and now you're putting the icing on the cake and bringing it into video. So
lots of skills to learn. Why wait? Start that first lecture.
Welcome to Video Effects, or often shortened to VFX. So what's coming up in this section? Well, this is all about combining our computer-generated imagery with real-world environments, or if you wanted to, combining it with other CGIs. So this can be your models that you've made, it can be your particle systems, it can be anything you've generated on the computer and combining it with, in this case, a still image. So we're going to start with a still image and place a model into it and make sure it looks relatively realistic. Obviously that will depend on the quality of your model as well. Now after we have mastered that, we will go ahead and conquer video footage as well, which has some other nitty-gritty things that we need to sort out. Choosing your subject. Now you can follow along with me, you can choose your own path or indeed do both. One of the best ways of learning is to also go off on a tangent and work on your own project as well, either in parallel or just after you've taken the section. It's a great way to reinforce your knowledge. Now remember to keep it simple. This goes for both your model, if you're going to make your own, and the real space that it is going to occupy. If we start to get too complex at this point in time, it's going to cause you issues. So remember to keep it simple. And talking about keeping it simple, it's time for a nice, simple challenge for you. So the challenge is to plan your scene. We are going to put a 3D model into a photograph. Now, ideas for a scene, the photograph itself, perhaps an empty road or a runway or a desk, a windowsill or any other worktop or work surface. Of course, it would be great when we're going to use a model. So what model are you going to use? It would be great if they matched up with the scene. Doesn't have to. It'd be interesting if it didn't, I suppose. But for an empty road, you might put a car on there, a runway, a plane, a worktop, perhaps in a kitchen. Well, perhaps any kitchen utensil, plates, glasses. Nice, simple models. Remember simplicity. Now use existing models and scenes where possible. This whole section is going about bringing these two things together rather than making them. So one of the things you can do here is use somewhere like BlendSwap. So do go ahead and check out www.blendswap.com for your models if you're going to use them. And remember to credit others for their hard work as well. Check out the Creative Commons license. All the blend files on BlendSwap tend to have one of those. Just make sure you credit others for their work. So pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Did you plan your scene? How did it turn out? I'm going to go through what I've planned for my scene now, and then we'll crack on and get on with it. So what do I want to do? Well, my scene is going to be a runway at sunset. And the object, I'm going to do a fighter jet, because that's kind of cool. That's what I like, and that's what I'm going to do. Of course, you guys can follow along with this, or indeed go down your own route as well. Please share with us over on the forum what you guys are going to be up to, what your plans are. Perhaps you've done some sketches of the scene that you want to do. Perhaps you've got some awesome resources in there. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys are going to create. And I will see you guys in the next lecture.